there is something happening right now that you cannot stop. Your breath is moving. The night is moving. Somewhere outside, a leaf is letting go of the branch it has held all season, not because it is ready, but because that is simply what leaves do. And when it falls, it does not end. It becomes something else entirely. That is what tonight is about. If you found your way here, something in you is already listening. Not for facts, not for instructions, for something quieter than both. A reminder of what you already sense but keep forgetting in the noise of everything. That nothing in this life holds still. That you were never supposed to hold still either. If you want to leave a small mark that you were here, the city, the hour on your clock, even just one word for what the night feels like where you are, I would love to know. There is something I find quietly beautiful about imagining all the different rooms, all the different kinds of dark, where these words are landing right now. Before the first story begins, I want to say something, not from the tradition, just from me. I started sitting with Impermanence the year a close friend died younger than anyone expected. I did not go looking for these teachings. I stumbled into them the way you stumble into a room and find a candle already burning. What stayed with me was not doctrine. It was this, across 2,500 years. Ordinary people kept meeting the same doorway. I still do not fully know what is on the other side, but it is a good place to stand in the dark. Tonight we walk through 9 of those lives. 9 people who met Impermanence not as a philosophy, but as something that arrived unannounced and changed everything. We will move slowly. There is nowhere else to be. Let your body be heavy now. Let the day be over. We begin with a woman who carried what could not be saved, and what she found when she finally set it down. Her name meant thin, lean, small. Kisa Gautami was born in a city called Savatthi, in northern India, more than 2,500 years ago, to a family without much. Not without love. There was love, the quiet kind that lives in poor households, the kind that knows how to stretch, to cover more surface than it seems like it should be able to, but without comfort, without cushion, without the sense that the world had made a deliberate space for her. She grew up understanding, the way children do before anyone tells them directly, that she would have to make her own room in the world. And she did. She married into a family of means. She moved into a house with more rooms than her childhood home. She learned the customs of a new household, the particular rhythms of a family not her own, the small adjustments you make when you are the newcomer and everyone else already knows where the water jar is kept, which mat belongs to whom, what tone of voice the elder prefers in the early morning, which silences are comfortable and which ones are not. She was tolerated. That is the honest word the old texts use. Tolerated. Because she came from little. Because her family had given no great dowry. Because in the world she lived in, a woman was measured by what she brought with her into a marriage, rather than what she was in herself. She moved through those rooms carefully. She learned to take up a certain amount of space and no more. She spoke when it was appropriate to speak. She occupied the position she had been given and tried not to need anything beyond it. Then her son was born. You have to understand what that meant. Not just as a matter of love, though it was that, enormously, completely that. But in the world Kisa Gotami lived in, a son was also a position. A son was the thing that transformed her from a woman who was merely permitted in a house into a woman who belonged to it. When she held him for the first time, something in the household shifted. People looked at her differently. They spoke to her differently. The elder smiled at her in a way that was different from all the previous smiles. She had done the thing that made her real, by the logic of that world, and for the first time since she had crossed the threshold of that house as a new wife, she felt the ground solid and certain beneath her feet. He was small, the way all children are small, and then he was less small, and then he was beginning to walk, which is the thing that changes a parent's breathing, that determined, lurching, beautiful forward movement into the world, and you standing just behind with your hands slightly raised, not quite touching, letting them fall a little, because falling is how they learn, but close, always close, ready to catch. Not catching, but ready. He was old enough to walk. He was not old enough for much else. And then he died. The texts do not record exactly what took him. A fever, most scholars believe. The kind that moves fast in the heat of that season. The kind that children have no defense against. The kind that can turn in an afternoon. One day he was there. Then there was a warmth in him that was not the right kind of warmth. And then there was a small body that had stopped being what it had been, and the house had a shape now that it had not had the day before. A new kind of emptiness in the rooms that he had been moving through. Kisa Gotami could not hold it. She did not believe it. This is the part of the story that people sometimes move past quickly, because it makes us uncomfortable to stay with it. She picked him up. She carried him. She walked out of the house and into the streets of Savatthi, carrying her dead son, and she went to every door she could find, and she asked whether anyone had medicine, whether they knew of someone who could help, whether there was something she had not thought of yet, some remedy, some person, some word that could still work. People stepped back from her gently. Some of them pitied her openly. Some of them tried to tell her as kindly as they could that her son was gone, that there was no medicine for what had happened. She heard them, or she appeared to hear them, and then she went to the next door anyway. This can look like something being broken, but it means something else if you sit with it long enough. It means that the love she had for that child was larger than the mind's capacity to close around what had happened. The mind does this. It refuses the thing that is too large to fit through the doorway of ordinary understanding. It keeps moving. It keeps looking. It keeps asking whether there is an exception somewhere that has not been found yet. Because the alternative, accepting that there is no exception, is a thing the mind does not know how to do all at once. Kisa Gotami was not shattered in any simple sense. She was doing the only thing that is possible when what you love is on one side of a door and you are being asked to stay on the other side of it permanently. She walked until someone told her about the teacher sitting outside the city in the deer park. He was teaching to whoever came to sit with him, which in those years was a large number of people from all kinds of lives. She came to him, still carrying the child. She stood in front of him and made the same request she had been making at every door. Medicine. Please. Is there anything you know of? He looked at her for what the texts describe as a long moment. And then he said yes, He said he could help her. He said there was a medicine that could work, but that he needed one ingredient before anything could be prepared. A handful of mustard seeds. Just that. Mustard seeds were the cheapest spice in any market in that city, a staple of every kitchen, something everyone had. This was not a difficult thing to find. She felt, for the first time in however many hours she had been walking, something shift in her chest. Something that was not yet relief, but was standing very close to it. But there was one condition. The mustard seeds had to come from a house where no one had ever died. She did not pause. She turned and walked back into the city, and she knocked on the first door she came to. They gave her the seeds immediately, pressing them into her palm with open hands. But when she asked whether anyone in this house had died, "Has there ever been a death here?" the woman at the door looked at her with an expression that Kisa Gotami did not quite understand yet. Yes, of course. The elder's father, 3 years ago now. It was a hard winter. Please, come in if you need to sit down. We know what grief feels like here. She thanked them and went to the next house. A grandfather at the second house. Long ago. But yes, he had died in the back room, in autumn, and his absence had taken a long time to stop feeling like a presence. At the third house, a child. Only the previous year. The family was still wearing that grief, the way you wear something new. It had not yet softened and settled into the edges of them. It was still in the center of everything, in the way they moved through the kitchen, in the pause before anyone laughed at anything. She continued through the afternoon. The light changed around her the way light does in that part of the world. The sharp heat of midday softening into the longer, more angled gold of late afternoon. She moved from street to street, door to door. At every house, the mustard seeds appeared before she had finished asking. People gave freely, hands extended, no hesitation. And everywhere, when she asked the second question, someone had died. A husband, a sister, an old woman who had lived long enough, but whose absence had still rearranged the shape of every ordinary hour. A young man gone without any warning. The kind of death that never stops being surprising, no matter how long you live with it. An infant who had not made it through the first year. A neighbor who had come to the wrong house at the wrong time. A stranger found at the side of the road. By the time the sun was close to the horizon, she had collected no mustard seeds. She sat down at the edge of the road. The texts say she watched the lamps being lit, one by one, in the houses and along the streets around her, each small flame appearing in a window or on a post and burning steadily. And then, she could see this now, in a way she had not been able to see it that morning, eventually going out. She sat there with what she had been carrying, and something opened in her that had been shut, not just since she had begun walking, for much longer, perhaps for most of her life. She had believed, without knowing clearly that she believed it, that she was singular in her grief. That was the deepest thing she had been carrying, not the loss itself, not even the impossibility of accepting the loss, but the terrible aloneness of it. The sense that something had happened to her that had not happened to the world. That she moved through a city full of people with intact lives, while hers had been split open. That there was a before and an after, and that she now existed permanently in the after, while everyone around her still had access to the before. but she had just walked through an entire city, door by door, street by street, and every single door had opened into someone's grief. Not all of them were carrying it the way she was, openly, visibly, refusing to put it down. Most of them had found ways to continue, to cook meals, to sell things in the market, to argue with their children over small things and laugh at ordinary things and hold what had been lost in some interior room that they kept mostly closed. But it was there, behind every face, at every table, beneath every ordinary day that looked, from outside, like nothing in particular was happening. There is no house free from this. She understood it not as a teaching she had been told to accept, not as something she was supposed to believe because someone wiser than her had said so, but as a fact she had confirmed herself, step by step, door by door, through an entire afternoon of walking. Impermanence was not something that had happened specifically to her. It was the texture of being alive. The people who appeared from the outside to have solid, untroubled lives had also lost things, were losing things right now, today, while she sat here at the roadside, would lose more. The surface of a life that looks intact is only the surface. Underneath, the same water is moving through every house. She went back to where the teacher was sitting. She came back with nothing in her hands. She had set her son down, somewhere along the way, in a place where the earth could receive what she had been carrying. She came back empty. He asked whether she had found the mustard seeds. She said, "I have finished with the mustard seeds. I understand now what you were sending me to find." He did not explain what she had learned, or repeat the lesson back to her in neater language, or tell her she had passed some kind of test. He simply looked at her the way someone looks at another person who has just returned from a very long distance, and acknowledged that she had understood rightly. Then he spoke to her, gently, about what she had found with her own feet, through her own long afternoon, that all things that arise will also pass, that there is no form in this world that does not become another form, that this is not a flaw in the design of living, but the design itself. She stayed. She joined the community of practitioners he was building. She shaved her head and put on the robes, and she sat and walked for many years. The texts record that one evening, a long time after that afternoon in the city, she was sitting in her room watching the flame of an oil lamp. She watched it waver in a small draft from somewhere, and steady itself, and waver again. And she understood something she had not quite reached even at the roadside. Even after all those doors, not just that flames end, but that the ending is continuous with the beginning. The oil had become heat. The heat had become light. The light had become the faint warmth that her skin could feel if she paid close attention. The slight change in the temperature of the air in the room. The flame did not end. It changed. It was always changing. The ending and the beginning were not two different things. Nothing is lost. Nothing holds still. Nothing ends the way we are afraid that ending means. She had walked into the thing she could not survive and come out the other side holding something that cannot be taught in a room, cannot be written in any text, cannot be passed from one person to another by any method except the long walking and the accumulation of doors. Most of us have some version of what Kisa Gautami knew at the beginning of that story. We know it the way you know what fire feels like before you have been burned. in theory, in language, in the form of things other people have told us. We understand, abstractly, that nothing lasts, that people we love will change, will leave, will eventually be in a form we cannot hold. We understand this. It sits somewhere in us as a fact we have acknowledged and then mostly do not think about. And then something happens, and we understand it differently, in a different part of ourselves, a part that does not deal in abstractions. Maybe you are in that place tonight. Maybe you have already had your afternoon of walking from door to door, your particular city, your particular version of what it means to knock on every door you can think of and find the same answer waiting at each one. Maybe you have already sat down at the edge of some road and watched the lights come on. Or maybe you are still walking. Maybe the understanding that is waiting for you has not arrived yet, and you are somewhere in the middle of the city, still hoping that the next door will be the one. Either way, you do not have to be anywhere other than where you are. The understanding came to Kisa Gotami when it came. Not when she decided she was ready for it. Not when she had done enough walking to deserve it. It arrived when it arrived, which was at the moment her body finally sat down and her hands were finally empty and she finally stopped looking for the next door. Let your breath move slowly now, the way it wants to move at this hour. Whatever you are holding tonight, the shape of what you have lost, the weight of what you are afraid of losing, the quiet presence of things that have already changed into something else. You do not have to hold it tightly right now. The night is large enough to hold it for you for a few hours while you rest. There is no house free from this, which means you have never been alone in it. The aloneness was always the part that was not true. The next story begins in a cemetery, in the dark, with a woman named Buddha who had already burned her life to the ground and walked out of the ash looking for something she could not name. She did not find it by moving away from the dark. She found it by walking toward it, on purpose, until it had nothing left to show her that she had not already seen. Her story begins with a decision she made in grief, and with what she did with the years that came after. There is one more thing worth staying with before we leave her story behind. When Kisa Gotami first came to the deer park, she was not thinking about impermanence as a teaching. She was thinking about her son. The philosophy was beside the point. The doorways she was asked to walk through were concrete and specific. This house, this family, these seeds, this loss. The understanding she arrived at was not a conclusion she reasoned her way to. It was something her body arrived at through the act of doing, through the physical movement of putting one foot in front of the other across an actual city in actual afternoon light. This is something the old teachers understood that gets lost when the teachings are summarized. You cannot think your way to the bone-deep knowledge that impermanence is universal. You can think your way to believing it, which is different. You can hold it as a proposition you agree with, but the moment it becomes something you know the way you know your own name, the way you know which direction is home even in the dark, that moment comes from some other place, from the body, from the accumulated experience of enough doors, from sitting down finally at the side of the road when the light has changed and the lamps have come on and your hands are empty. Most of the time, when we are in the middle of loss or grief, or the particular disorientation of watching something you thought was permanent begin to change, most of the time, we cannot tell that we are in the middle of that process. It only looks like a process from the outside, or from afterward. From inside it, it looks like an afternoon. It looks like walking. It looks like door after door after door, and a question you keep asking, and answers you did not want. And legs that keep moving anyway, because what else is there to do? Kisa Gautami did not know, when she left the deer park with her errand, that she was in the middle of the teaching. She thought she was looking for mustard seeds. You may not know either, tonight, what it is you are in the middle of. But the walking is not wasted. The doors are not wasted. The particular quality of whatever afternoon you are moving through, its light, its weight, the way it is asking you to keep going, even when you are not sure what you are going toward, none of it is separate from what you are becoming. Let your body settle now. Let the night do what it came to do. The next story begins in a cemetery, in the dark, with a woman named Bada who had already burned her life to the ground and walked out of the ash looking for something she could not name. She did not find it by moving away from the dark. She found it by walking toward it, on purpose, until it had nothing left to show her that she had not already seen. Her story begins with a decision she made in grief, and with what she did with the years that came after. She was her father's daughter, which meant she had been loved and protected and told, in the particular wordless way that sheltered girls are told these things, that the world was something that happened to other people. Her father was a treasurer in the court of Rajagriha. This was a city of substance and consequence in ancient India, a place with walls and markets and the kind of social hierarchy that everyone inside it understood without needing to be taught explicitly. Bada grew up inside that understanding. She grew up with the comfortable assumption that her life would be arranged carefully, the way the lives of daughters of careful men were arranged, with deliberation, with attention to suitable matches, with the reasonable expectation that one form of security would give way to another, and that the shape of her days would be legible from one season to the next. She was also, by everything the texts record, exceptionally intelligent. The kind of intelligence that does not sit quietly. She read. She formed opinions. She expressed those opinions in ways that not every household welcomed in a young woman of her position. But her father loved her and had enough standing to allow her a certain latitude that other daughters did not enjoy. She was protected by his love and by his position, and she knew this, though she probably did not think of it in those terms. It was simply the water she had always swum in. Then she looked out of a window and saw a man in chains being led through the street below. He was being escorted somewhere, to trial, to punishment. The texts are not specific, and she saw him through the narrow opening in the upper story of her father's house. And something in her fixed on him with the particular certainty that sheltered young women who have never been told no in any way that truly mattered sometimes arrive at. She decided she wanted him. Not in a careful way, not in a way that left room for reconsideration. She decided with the full weight of all the wanting she had been accumulating in those rooms. She told her father, "This can sound like a story about foolishness, but it is not, or not only. It is a story about how the heart of a person who has never been seriously thwarted responds when it encounters something it wants badly enough." She was not deluded about who he was. She could see that he was a prisoner, could see from where he was being taken that his life was not the kind of life her father would choose for her. She wanted him anyway. The wanting was stronger than the information. Her father tried the gentle forms of persuasion available to a man who loved his daughter. She persisted. She was very good at persisting. She had had years of practice at the soft and inexhaustible application of wanting, and eventually the man who loved her went to the officials and made the arrangements that needed to be made, paid what needed to be paid, and the man was freed and brought to the house, and there was a marriage. For a while, it worked the way she had imagined it would work. Or she told herself it did, which is not quite the same thing. He was with her. She had gotten what she had wanted. That is one kind of working. But he was looking at the house the way someone looks at a house when they are calculating what it contains and whether it is accessible. He was doing math she was not part of. He was present in the rooms, but his attention was on the architecture of the situation. What was here? Who controlled it? What the possibilities were? She may have sensed this and set it aside. Or she may not have sensed it yet. The texts do not tell us what she knew or when she knew it. What the texts tell us is what happened next. He suggested a pilgrimage, a journey to a sacred site in the hills, the kind of devotional excursion that made perfect sense for a newly married couple, the kind of thing no one would think to question. She went with him. They climbed. The path rose through trees and rock, and then above the trees, into the clearer air of the high places, and eventually they came to a cliff. He told her what he intended. She had a few seconds in which to understand what was happening and to decide what to do with those seconds. She was frightened. She must have been. Anyone would have been. But she was also, even in that moment, the daughter of a man who had raised her to think quickly. She asked permission to perform a ritual gesture of farewell, to walk around him, to bow before him from all four directions, in the manner of honoring someone of great authority, a mark of submission, the posture of someone who has accepted their situation. He led her, because it confirmed something he believed about the relationship between them. She walked around behind him, and she pushed. She stood at the edge of that cliff for a long time after. The wind, the extraordinary stillness that comes after something irrevocable, the view of the valley below that she had not really seen on the way up, because on the way up she had been thinking about other things, and now she had nothing to think about except what her hands had just done and where she was and what came next. She could not go home. That is the first thing she understood, standing there. Not because she had done something that her father's love could not survive. She was not certain it could not, and she would never know, because she made the decision standing on that cliff, and she did not go back to test it. She could not go home because she was not the same person who had left home. And the home she had left had been built around a version of herself that had just ceased to exist. She walked until she found a community of renunciants. They happened to be Jains, practitioners of a tradition that ran alongside Buddhism in that part of the world, with its own disciplines, its own way of approaching the question of suffering and liberation. They accepted her. They performed the ritual of her ordination, which in their practice included pulling the hair from her head by the roots, to mark the transition from one life to another. Her hair grew back, because hair does. It grew back in thick waves and curls, which was not what she had had before, and which became her name. Kundalakesa, curly hair, the name the new life gave her, the name she carried for the rest of her years. She was good at practice the way she had been good at everything else. Quickly, thoroughly, with the full force of that particular intelligence applied to whatever was in front of her. She studied the Jain teachings and absorbed them. She wandered, the way practitioners wandered in that era, through the regions of Anga and Magadha and Kasi and Kosala, going where the learning took her, eating on alms, sleeping in whatever shelter the next village offered. She became a debater, skilled enough that she would put a heap of sand at a crossroads as an invitation to anyone who wanted to argue with her about the nature of things, and she could hold her own against teachers from any number of traditions. But the practice did not touch the particular place inside her that needed touching. She did not have a clear name for that place. She knew it was there the way you know something is in a room with you when you cannot see it, by the way the air feels slightly different, by some peripheral sense that something is occupying the space. She had learned a great deal. She had developed real discipline, real depth of study, the kind of facility with ideas that comes from years of application. But something was not yet reached. One day she came to a crossroads and put down her pile of sand in the usual way, and a monk named Sariputta came along. He was a senior student of the teacher in the deer park, the same teacher who had sent Kisa Gotami out with her impossible errand. They argued, as was the custom, and somewhere in the argument, Sariputta said something that she had not heard said before, something that pointed in a direction the Jain teaching had not pointed. He directed her to the teacher. She came to him with the whole accumulated weight of her life in her, with the cliff and the years of wandering and the things she had learned and the thing that had still not been reached. She stood before him and they talked. The texts say she asked about the nature of impermanence, about what it means for something to end completely, and whether anything persists, and what the relationship is between the form a thing takes and what it actually is. He did not give her a philosophy. He gave her something more like a series of observations, carefully made, about what she had already been living through, that the self she had been in her father's house had already ended and become something else, that the self she had been on the cliff had already ended and become something else, that the woman who had wandered for years through those 4 provinces was not the same woman who had pulled the hair from her head at ordination, though she wore the same name and carried the same memories. That all of this, the changing, the ending, the becoming, was not a catastrophe that had happened to her. It was what she was. It was what everything was. She understood, not as an idea, as a recognition. She asked to stay. She ordained in his community. She sat and practiced, and the texts record that she attained what the tradition calls liberation, the freedom that comes not from never changing or losing anything, but from no longer being in resistance to the fact that everything changes and nothing holds still. For 50 years, she walked through those same 4 regions, Anga, Magadha, Kasi, Kosala, this time not looking for the understanding she had not yet found, but as someone who had found it and was simply continuing to walk. The Therigatha records a few lines she spoke near the end of her life, looking back at the road she had traveled, grateful to the stranger who had given her a robe when she had nothing and was just beginning the wandering. Small gratitude for a small thing, the kind of gratitude that only makes sense when you have stopped needing anything more. There is a detail in her story that does not appear in the most common retellings, and it is the one that stays with me most. At some point during her years with the Jain community, before she found her way to the deer park, she came to a cemetery, a charnel ground, the open place outside the city where bodies were left after death, where the earth did what the earth does, where impermanence was not an abstract teaching but a visible, immediate, sensory fact. She stood there and she looked at what was in front of her. A body in a late stage of decomposition, the process that we mostly agree not to look at directly. She asked the Jain teachers with her, "What does this mean? What is this? What is the teaching here?" And they could not answer her. Not because they were foolish people or shallow practitioners. They had their own wisdom, their own path, things they understood deeply that other traditions did not. But this particular question, what does the ending of this body mean? What remains? What the relationship is between the form that was once a person and the process that is now happening to what remains of that form? This question they could not answer in a way that satisfied her. That inadequacy was what sent her looking. That standing in a cemetery in the dark, asking a real question and not receiving a real answer, was the beginning of the last leg of the journey that eventually brought her to the crossroads where Sariputta was walking. This is something the story holds quietly, without insisting on it. That the hardest questions, the ones that arrive in cemeteries, in the places we do not usually go, in the moments we do not usually permit ourselves, those questions are not signs that something is wrong with the asking. They are the questions that need to be asked. They are the ones the soul keeps returning to, in one form or another, across the length of a life, until they receive an answer that has the right weight. You may have questions like that. Most people do, though they might not put them in these terms. Questions about what happens when things end, about whether the people you have lost are simply gone, or whether they have become something else. The way the flame becomes heat, and the heat becomes warmth in the air. About whether the version of yourself that existed before some irreversible moment has ended permanently, or whether it is still somewhere in you, changed into something you have not fully recognized yet. These questions do not have easy answers. Buddha wandered for years, before she found even the shape of the room where the answer might be sitting. That is not a failure of the questioning. That is what honest questioning looks like. Let your body be soft now. Let the breath move without effort. The wandering in these stories is not metaphor. These were real women who walked real roads in real heat and real dark, carrying real grief and real uncertainty for real years. The distance between where they started and where they arrived was measured in the actual movement of actual feet on actual ground. And the arrival, when it came, was not a destination they had been able to see from the beginning. It was something they only recognized when they were already inside it. You are already inside something. Tonight. This dark, this hour, this particular quality of rest that is coming for you, whether you have finished thinking or not. The questions can be here with you. They do not need to be resolved before you are allowed to sleep. Buddha Kundalakesa walked 50 years through those provinces and came to the end of her life in a state the texts describe simply as free. Not free from loss or change or the fact of impermanence. Free from the need for any of that to be otherwise. That is a different kind of freedom than the one we usually imagine when we use the word. The third story travels north and east, to a hillside in ancient Thailand, to a man who spent years sleeping in forests and charnel grounds and places most people take great care to avoid. and who found in that darkness not what he feared, but what he had been looking for all along. His name was Luang Pu Mun. He was a farmer's son from the northeastern plains, and he became one of the most quietly extraordinary practitioners of the 20th century. His story begins in the ordinary and moves, slowly and without drama, towards something that is very difficult to put into words, but that the body, at this hour, in this dark, may already know something about. Before we move to that third story, stay here a moment longer. There is something in Buddha's particular journey that is easy to miss if you move through it too quickly. She did not go looking for impermanence as a topic. She did not set out to study the teaching of change as though it were a subject in a curriculum. She was pushed toward it, in stages, by the accumulation of things she could not hold, the marriage she had wanted, which turned out not to be what she wanted, the act on the cliff, which she could not undo, and which therefore became the permanent first chapter of the rest of her life, the Jain practice, which gave her real tools and real depth, and still did not reach the room she needed to reach, the cemetery and the question no one could answer. And then, finally, the road to the teacher, and the conversation, and the recognition. She did not get there in one movement. She got there through what can only be called the slow, patient education of a life that refused to give her anything easy. Every time she arrived somewhere that felt like it might be permanent, the father's house, the marriage, the Jain community, the reputation as a debater, that thing changed shape, became something else, pointed her forward. This can sound, when it is described from outside, like a life organized by suffering. But she did not experience it that way, or not only that way. Each stage was real in its own terms. The years with the Jain practitioners were real years, with real learning in them. The debates were genuine engagements of a genuine mind. The wandering through those 4 provinces was not simply waiting to arrive somewhere else. It was the actual texture of her life, the substance of it. What changed is not that her life became less full. What changed is that she stopped needing any particular arrangement of it to persist. She stopped measuring the value of any given form by how long it lasted. A flower is not less beautiful because it opens and closes in a single day. The conversation with a stranger on a road is not less real because it ends at the next crossroads. Buddha came to understand something about the forms her life kept taking, that each one was complete in itself, that the ending of any one form was not an erasure of what had been real in it. The cliff was real. The grief was real. The wandering was real. The freedom at the end of all of it was also real. None of these cancelled any of the others. They were all the same continuous thread of a single life, changing form. The way all things change form. The way everything in this world is always changing form, whether we see it or not. That is not a small thing to arrive at. It is one of the most difficult things a human being can learn. And she learned it not by avoiding the hard places, but by walking into them, all the way in, until they had nothing left to withhold. Let that settle. Let your breathing be long and unhurried. The night is large and has no particular business other than holding you for these hours. The third story travels north and east, to a hillside in ancient Thailand, to a man who spent years sleeping in forests and charnel grounds, and places most people take great care to avoid, and who found in that darkness not what he feared, but what he had been looking for all along. His name was Luang Pumun. He was a farmer's son from the northeastern plains, and he became one of the most quietly extraordinary practitioners of the 20th century. His story begins in the ordinary and moves, slowly and without drama, towards something that is very difficult to put into words, but that the body, at this hour, in this dark, may already know something about. He was born on a Thursday in January, in the year 1870, in a farming village on the Mekong River in the northeastern plains of Thailand. The village was small enough that everyone in it knew which families had been there the longest and which ones were newer, and what the river looked like in the dry season when it pulled back from the banks and left a wide band of reddish sand, and what it looked like in the wet season when it swelled and moved with force and turned the color of the earth it was carrying. His father grew rice. His mother kept the household. He was the eldest of 9 children, which means he understood early, in the wordless way that eldest children understand things, that the world does not arrange itself around any single person's needs, that you make space, that you pay attention, that other people's difficulties are real and not smaller than your own simply because they are not yours. He was ordained as a novice monk at 16, which was a common path for boys of that time and place, not an unusual decision, not a dramatic departure from the life that was expected of him, simply the natural movement of a young man who had been sitting in the monastery at the edge of the village, watching the monks move through their days, and had found something in that watching that interested him more than the rice fields. He stayed. That is the part that is less common. Most novices return to lay life after a few years. He did not. He took full ordination at 22 and began what would become more than 50 years of wandering practice, moving through forests and mountains, sleeping in caves and under the open sky, spending extended periods in the places that ordinary life goes to great lengths to arrange itself away from. Charnel grounds, places where the bodies of the dead were left. This practice had a name and a long history in the Thai forest tradition, contemplating death not as a morbid exercise, but as a precision instrument for understanding impermanence in its most immediate form. You cannot sit for long in a charnel ground without the abstract teaching becoming concrete. The body you are sitting next to is doing what all bodies do. The process is unhurried and complete. It does not require your agreement. It asks nothing of your feelings about it. He practiced this for years. He would walk for hours through forest paths, using a large umbrella with a mosquito net. The clot, the particular tool of the wandering Thai forest monk, a kind of portable shelter that you carry on a pole over your shoulder and set up over your sleeping mat when you stop for the night. He would find a place that felt right, sometimes beside a stream, sometimes on a hillside, sometimes at the edge of a village cremation ground, and he would sit through the night. The forests of northeastern Thailand in the early 20th century were not gentle places. Tigers moved through them. Cobras crossed the paths at night. Large ones, the kind that do not move quickly out of the way. Malaria was common. The heat in the dry season was absolute, the kind of heat that reorganizes your sense of what the body can endure. The cold in the uplands in winter was sharper than most people expected Thailand to be. He walked through all of it. He slept under a muslin net in the rain. He sat with fevers rather than leaving the forest to find medicine. using the fever as an object of contemplation, the way a different kind of practitioner might use a candle flame or a sound. He entered states of concentration deep enough that the texts say his disciples sometimes could not tell, watching him, whether he was still breathing. He was not trying to punish himself. That is the misunderstanding people sometimes bring to this kind of practice. He was trying to see clearly, and the thing he was trying to see clearly was the thing that is most difficult to see clearly from inside the ordinary arrangements of a comfortable life, that everything is always changing, that the sense of solidity and continuity that a settled life provides is real in its way, but not the whole picture, that there is something underneath the apparent permanence of things that is moving constantly, that the very ground you stand on is not as still as it feels. The forest makes this harder to pretend otherwise. A settled life in a town, with walls and routines and the reassuring repetition of familiar days, allows a person to maintain a certain ambient fiction about how stable things are. The forest does not maintain this fiction. Things appear and disappear. Sounds arrive and vanish. The light changes faster than you expect. The body feels the temperature and the moisture and the presence of things that are alive near you in the dark. And all of these remind you, without argument, that you are a creature in a world of creatures, and that this world is not still. He practiced in this way for decades. He moved through provinces, following the direction of where the practice wanted to take him, spending extended periods in particular places and then moving on. Other monks heard about him and came to practice with him. He taught them not primarily by speaking. He was not, by nature, a man of many words, but by example, by the quality of attention he brought to every ordinary moment of the day, by the way he moved through the world as though each step was the only step, as though this moment was the only moment that had ever existed or would. There is a teaching that his disciples preserved, spoken near the end of his life, that has a quality to it I keep returning to. He was 70 years old, or thereabouts, still moving, but no longer with the same ease as before. His body was doing what bodies do over time. The knees that had carried him across thousands of miles of forest path were speaking in a different register. The eyes that had watched uncountable dawns arrive over the tree line needed more light than they used to. He was aware of all of this. He was, after all, a man who had spent his life paying close attention to what the body was doing. One morning, he was sitting before a meal, or perhaps resting between periods of walking meditation, and there was a vase nearby, some vessel that a lay supporter had brought, filled with starburst flowers, the bright orange kind, the kind that seem lit from inside on the day they are cut. He looked at the flowers. 3 days passed. He looked at them again. They had changed. The petals that had been vivid and upright were beginning to soften at the edges. The color that had seemed lit from inside was becoming something else, still orange, but with a different quality. The way something looks when the inner light has started to leave it. The stamens that had been straight were curving. The whole arrangement that had seemed to declare itself so fully on the first day was now in the middle of becoming something different. He spoke about this to his students. He said, "Watch what is happening here. Not the fact of it. You know the fact already, that flowers wilt, that cut flowers wilt faster, that this is what happens. Watch the thing itself. The way the form is changing without asking permission. The way the color is doing what color does when the cells that hold it stop holding it The way the arrangement that seemed complete on the first day was never complete. It was always already in motion, always already becoming the third day. He said when you were young, you looked good. You were healthy. You moved easily through the world and your body went where you asked it to go without comment. Then, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, the impermanence that was always in the cells of you began to be more visible. The eyes that used to be bright became different eyes. The body that used to be strong began to speak to you in new registers. The things that used to be effortless began to require something from you. He said this is the same thing as the flower. Not a punishment. Not a failure. The same movement. The same world doing what the world does. He said those who are not reckless will look at this and understand that today, while you still have strength, is the time to practice. Not to resist the impermanence, to understand it, to let the understanding change the relationship between you and everything you are holding on to. He was not speaking from a distance. He was speaking from inside the process. He was an old man talking about what it is like to be an old man, using a vase of flowers as the example, because the vase of flowers was right there, and it was showing him the same thing he had been looking at in the charnel grounds 50 years before, in a form that was easier to sit with at the breakfast table. The wild tigers of the forest are different from the flowers in the vase, but they are teaching the same thing. The fever in the body during a difficult retreat is different from the slow change in the color of aging petals, but they are teaching the same thing. Everything the world contains is teaching the same thing, if you are paying the right kind of attention. Not urgently, not with alarm, with the quality of attention that says, I see you. I am not looking away. This is what he spent his life practicing. The not looking away. Most of us spend a significant portion of our lives looking away. This is not a moral failing. It is a reasonable response to information that is difficult to absorb. The mind protects itself. It turns toward the things that feel manageable and away from the things that feel too large. This is the mind doing its job, but the looking away has a cost. The things we are not looking at do not disappear because we are not looking at them. They simply become the shape of a vague unease that moves through the hours with us, never fully named, never directly faced, sitting at the edge of attention, the way a sound sits, at the edge of hearing, present, but not acknowledged. What Luang Pu Mun found in the forests and the charnel grounds was not comfort in the way we usually mean that word. He did not find reassurance that the things he feared were not real or would not happen. He found something different, a way of being in the presence of impermanence that did not require him to be elsewhere, a quality of attention that could stay, that could watch the starburst flowers go from the first day to the third day without needing the third day to be the first day. This is the thing that the sleep meditation videos and the breathwork protocols and the various techniques for quieting the anxious mind are all pointing toward, from different angles. Not the suppression of the awareness of impermanence. The opposite, the full acknowledgement of it, all the way in, until the acknowledgement itself becomes a form of rest. Because the exhaustion of the mind is not caused by knowing that things change. It is caused by the constant effort of trying to hold them still. When you stop trying to hold things still, the exhaustion lifts. Not all at once. Not permanently. Because the trying to hold things still is a habit, and habits have their own momentum. But it lifts. The ground under you, which you have been gripping with some inner musculature, you may not have had a name for, becomes something you can simply stand on. The breath, which has been slightly held against something, becomes something you can simply take. This is what Luang Pu Mun knew. This is what he was pointing to with the flowers. You do not need to go to a forest tonight. You do not need to have spent 50 years in charnel grounds or under a clot in the rain. The flowers are right here. The breath is right here. The way this hour is already becoming the next hour. The way the dark of this room will eventually give way to whatever comes after dark. All of it is already showing you the same thing the forest showed him. You do not have to look at it straight on. Not tonight. Tonight, you only need to let the body rest. But somewhere in the resting, if you are very quiet and very still, you may feel it, the way the moment you are in is already moving, already becoming something else, and how that movement is not frightening when you stop fighting it. How it is actually, in a way that is very hard to name, something close to peaceful. Let your eyes be soft. Let your jaw be soft. Let whatever you have been holding in the body today begin to release. Slowly, the way a fist releases when the effort of holding has finally passed. The fourth story moves across the sea to Japan, 700 years ago, to a monk who climbed a mountain looking for something he had been told was in China, spent years failing to find it, and then sat down one ordinary day and understood that he had been carrying it the whole time. His name was Dogen, and what he wrote when he came back from that journey contained a sentence so precise and so strange that people have been sitting with it for 8 centuries and still finding new ground inside it. But before we follow Dogen across that sea, stay here. One more moment with the man in the forest. There is something about Luang Pu Mun's practice that is easy to admire from a distance and easy to misread in the same movement. The charnel grounds, the tigers, the decades of walking with almost nothing. It can read, if you are not careful, as a kind of heroic asceticism, impressive, extreme, not something for ordinary people in ordinary lives. The kind of thing you read about and think, remarkable, and then go back to whatever you were doing. But that is not what he was doing. He was not performing endurance. He was not trying to demonstrate that the body could withstand more than most people expected. He was trying to get the teaching out of his head and into his bones. He was trying to understand impermanence the way Kisa Gautami understood it on that road, not as a proposition to be agreed with, but as something you know in the body, in the actual lived weight of the days. The charnel grounds were a method. The forests were a method. The fever held as an object of meditation was a method. The underlying aim was not different from the aim of someone who sits quietly in a comfortable room and watches their breath move in and out, and notices how each breath is not quite the same as the last one. How even in the most ordinary and protected of environments, the world is moving and changing and becoming something else, moment by moment, without asking your permission. He once said, and this was recorded by one of his students, who wrote down what he could remember of the conversations during those long years in the forest, that the practice of contemplating impermanence is not about becoming comfortable with death. It is about becoming comfortable with life. Because life is the same process. Life is not the stable thing, and death is the interruption. Life is the movement, and death is one of the forms that movement takes. The flower does not stop being the flower when it wilts. It becomes a different expression of the same continuous process that has been happening all along. This can sound, when you first encounter it, like a kind of argument, like a clever reframing of something frightening into something more acceptable. And the mind will sometimes respond to it that way, as a debating position, as a philosophy, as something to think about and perhaps push back on. But that is not the register in which it lands for most people who have spent real time with it. For most people who have sat with this long enough, it lands differently. It lands as something that was already true before anyone said it. Something the body already knew and the mind was slow to catch up to. Like being told the name of a feeling you have been having for years without knowing what to call it. The feeling of impermanence is not foreign to any of us. We have all felt it. The moment when you are in the middle of something good and you become suddenly aware that it will end. A meal, take conversation, a particular quality of afternoon light in a room. The way joy and something like grief can arrive together in those moments. Because the joy and the awareness of the ending are the same perception looking in two directions at once. That feeling is not a mistake. That is the clear sight that the starburst flowers were pointing to. That is what Luang Pu Mun was learning to sustain. Not for moments, but for the long hours of a night in a forest. Not occasionally, but as the continuous background quality of a waking life. He died at 79, in November of 1949, in a monastery in Sakon Nakhon province. His disciples were with him. They turned his head to face east, as was the custom. He had been moving toward this for months, his body doing what bodies do in their final season. And he had been watching it the way he had watched the fever and the weather and the flowers, with the full, unhurried attention of someone who has spent a lifetime learning not to look away. The relics of his body are distributed across several temples in northeastern Thailand. His teachings were written down by students who had spent years listening to him in those forests. People still travel to the places where he practiced. Not because the places have magic in them, but because something about standing where someone stood who understood something deeply has its own particular quality. A quality that is not so different, actually, from the quality of sitting very still in a dark room at the edge of sleep and feeling, without quite being able to name it, that everything is moving and nothing is wrong. Let your breath be easy. Let the muscles around your eyes go soft. There is nothing you need to accomplish in what remains of this night. The walking has been done. The understanding is somewhere ahead of you, or already inside you, or arriving on its own schedule without requiring your effort. The fourth story moves across the sea, to Japan, 700 years ago. To a monk who climbed a mountain looking for something he had been told was in China, spent years failing to find it, and then sat down one ordinary day and understood that he had been carrying it the whole time. His name was Dogen, and what he wrote when he came back from that journey contained a sentence so precise and so strange that people have been sitting with it for 8 centuries and still finding new ground inside it. He was 2 years old when his father died. He was 7 when his mother died. She died in the spring, and he watched from somewhere nearby, a child standing at a particular remove from a thing he was too young to hold, and what he saw was the incense smoke rising from the offering and drifting toward the ceiling and dispersing into the room. The smoke that had been a column became a diffusion, became the air of the room. It did not end. It became something you could no longer see. He remembered this for the rest of his life. His name was Dogen. He was born in Kyoto in the year 1200, into a family of the court aristocracy, which meant that the rooms he grew up in were beautiful, and the education he received was serious, and he moved through the world with the particular kind of ease that comes from never having had to wonder, in any practical sense, whether there would be food or shelter, or someone to teach you to read. He was fortunate in those ways, and he knew it. And the fortune did not protect him from the grief. When his mother died, he was 7 years old, and the incense smoke was rising, and something in him that would take decades to fully articulate formed itself in that room. Not as a thought, as a felt question. The smoke is there and then it is not there in the way it was before. His mother is there and then she is not there in the way she was before. What is the relationship between those two facts? What does it mean for a form to change into something that is still present but no longer visible? He was 7. He did not have these words. He had the feeling that eventually, many years later, and many miles from that room, generated the words. He was ordained at 13, which was young even for that era, and he began studying at the major Buddhist institutions of Japan. He was, by every account, a serious and gifted student, the kind who moves through the curriculum quickly and then finds himself at the edge of what the curriculum contains, standing at the boundary of what the teachers can offer and looking out over the territory beyond. What stopped him was a question. The question was this: if all beings possess Buddha nature, as the teaching says, if the nature of awakening is already present in every creature, not as something to be attained, but as something that is already there, then why is there any practice at all? Why sit in meditation? Why study? Why do anything? If the thing you are seeking is already what you are, what is the point of seeking? This can sound like the kind of philosophical puzzle that a very intelligent young monk might construct as an intellectual exercise. But it was not that for him. It was a genuine and urgent question about whether the life he was living made sense, whether the path he was on led anywhere real, or whether the whole apparatus of Buddhist practice was somehow beside the point of what it claimed to be about. He brought the question to every teacher he could find in Japan. No one gave him an answer that reached the actual weight of it. This is not a criticism of those teachers. It was a genuinely difficult question, and the answers available in the Japanese Buddhism of that era were, for various historical reasons, not adequate to it. He was asking something real, and the real answer was not in the books or the institutions or the conversations available to him. He heard that the answer might be in China. This was not a simple trip. In the early 13th century, crossing the sea between Japan and China was a significant undertaking. The boats were small. The crossing could take weeks. The weather over that strait was unpredictable and sometimes fatal. He arranged passage. He crossed. He arrived on the Chinese mainland and made his way to the major Chan monasteries of the Song dynasty, looking for the teacher who could answer the question he had been carrying since he was 7 years old, watching the incense smoke. He spent years there. He studied under several teachers. He learned. He also failed to find, for a long time, the answer he had come for. The question was still present. The sense that something essential was still unresolved sat with him through years of practice and study in those Chinese mountain monasteries. And then he came to a teacher named Rujing. Rujing was the abbot of a monastery on Tiantong Mountain. He was known for a particular severity of practice, long hours of sitting meditation, very little sleep, an uncompromising attention to the quality of presence in every moment of the day. He and Dogen understood each other almost immediately. The way people who are asking the same question in different languages sometimes recognize each other before they have exchanged a meaningful word. One night, during a period of intensive sitting practice, something happened. A monk near Dogen had fallen asleep during the sitting. Rujing moved through the hall and struck the monk's meditation cushion and said, loudly, into the silence of the hall, Zazen is the dropping away of body and mind. This is what the texts record. The phrase arrived in the room like something falling from a height. Dogen heard it, not as a teacher saying something to a student, not as a proposition being advanced, but as something that entered him in a different register entirely. Something that did not require processing or evaluation or comparison with other things he had been told. He left the hall. He went to Rujing's room. He lit incense and he bowed. Rujing looked at him and asked why he was burning incense. Dogen said body and mind have been dropped away. Rujing leaned forward. He said, you have dropped away body and mind. Body and mind have been dropped away. He did not explain this further. He did not expand or elaborate or make sure that Dogen had understood correctly. The exchange was complete. The understanding was complete. Dogen would spend the next 20 years trying to write down what happened in that room, in the way a person tries to draw a landscape they have seen once in extraordinary light, knowing that the drawing will always be less than the thing, but making the drawing anyway because others need to be able to find their way toward that country. He returned to Japan. He brought nothing with him, he said, except an understanding of the eyes. Not a doctrine, not a method, not a set of instructions. The quality of seeing that had opened in that room on Tiantong Mountain. He established a monastery in the mountains of Ekizan, in what is now Fukui Prefecture, in a region of Japan where the winters are serious and the snow comes deep and stays. He sat and he taught and he wrote. He wrote an enormous amount, essays and instructions and poems and lectures, collected in a work called the Shobogenzo, the treasury of the true Dharma Eye, which is one of the most demanding and most extraordinary texts in the Buddhist literature of any tradition. In the very first essay of that collection, the one called Genjo Koan, which is sometimes translated as the actualization of the fundamental point, he wrote a sentence about impermanence that has been sitting in me since I first encountered it. He wrote, flowers fall even though we love them. That is the whole sentence. 5 words. Flowers fall even though we love them. He continued, weeds grow even though we dislike them. And this, he said, is the way of all things. On first reading, this can seem simple to the point of being obvious. Of course, flowers fall. Everyone knows this. This is not a new observation. What is there to stop at? But that is not the register in which he meant it. And with enough time inside it, it is not the register in which it lands. What he was pointing to is the gap between knowing something and allowing it. Between the abstract acknowledgement that flowers fall, yes, I understand this. I have heard this. Impermanence. Of course, and the actual full-bodied meeting of the flower that is falling right now. The particular flower, the one you love. In this moment when you would very much prefer it to stay. Most of us live almost entirely in the gap between knowing and allowing. We know that nothing lasts. We have been told this, and we believe it. and we can repeat it when it is relevant. And then the thing we love begins to change. And the response of the heart and the body is not knowing and believing. The response is a reaching, a tightening, a very strong preference that this particular thing would please stay in the form that we have come to depend on. We love the flower. The flower falls. We knew this would happen. We greet the falling with grief and resistance anyway. This is not hypocrisy. It is not a failure of understanding. It is the honest description of what it is like to be a person who loves things in a world where everything changes. What Dogen found in that room on Tiantong Mountain, what arrived in him at the sound of the phrase dropping away of body and mind, was not an absence of love or an absence of attachment. It was something different. A quality of meeting the falling flower that was not the same as the resistance, but was also not a cold detachment from it. Something closer to what you might call full acknowledgement. The flower is falling. I love it. I am watching it fall. These are not in conflict. The falling is part of what the flower is. The falling is the flower continuing to be the flower. In its next form, he was 7 years old, watching the incense smoke when the question formed. He was 24 or 25 years old in a Chinese monastery when an answer arrived that could actually meet the question. He spent the rest of his life, another 26 years, until he died of illness at the age of 53, trying to write down what that meeting felt like, so that other people could orient toward it. He never fully succeeded. You cannot write down what it feels like. You can only write down things that point in the direction of it, the way a finger points toward the moon without being the moon. He knew this. He kept writing anyway. 26 years of pointing. There is something in that I find quietly overwhelming, if I let myself stay with it. Not the heroism of it, though it is heroic in its way, but the specific quality of what he was doing. He had understood something. He knew that what he had understood could not be transmitted directly. He also knew that human beings need to be pointed toward things, that the pointing matters even when it is incomplete, that the effort of finding words for the wordless is not futile even when it fails to fully succeed. He wrote for the monks in his community, who were sitting with him in that snowy mountain monastery. He wrote for people 700 years in the future who would open a book and find a sentence that stopped them. He wrote for you, in some sense, though he did not know you and could not have imagined this moment. Flowers fall even though we love them. He did not say, learn not to love the flowers. He did not say, cultivate a distance from what you love so that the falling does not affect you. He said the falling is part of the loving. The falling is the flower. The grief at the falling is not a mistake in the system. It is the system. It is what it means to be a creature who loves things in a world that is always moving. What changes when you have been inside this long enough is not the love or the grief. What changes is the quality of presence you bring to the flower while it is still open. The full attention. The way you are actually in the room with it, not already anticipating the third day when the color will have begun to leave it. Not defending yourself against the future falling by holding the present form at a certain emotional distance. You are here with the flower. Now, that is what he found in China. That is what he brought back to Japan. That is what the incense smoke was pointing toward when his mother died, and he was 7 years old and too young to have any of the words for what he was seeing, but old enough to let the image go all the way in and stay there for 20 years until the room on Tiantong Mountain gave it a name. Let your breathing be easy, long and easy, in and out. The flower of this day is already falling. The flower of this night is falling too, becoming morning, becoming the light that will be in the room when you open your eyes. You do not need to hold it still. You do not need to be anywhere other than here, in the falling. The next story stays in Asia but moves earlier in time, to a king who stood in a forest after a great victory and felt, in the silence, after all the noise, something he had not expected to feel. He had won everything a man of his era could win. He stood in the forest with his army around him, and he understood, with the kind of certainty that only comes after you have gotten exactly what you wanted, that what he was holding was not what he had thought he was reaching for. His name was Buddha. He was a king, and one morning in a forest he began laughing, or weeping, or something between the two that does not have a clean name in any language. And the people who heard him did not understand at all what they were hearing. Before we leave Dogen, there is one more thing the essay Genji Koan holds that is worth staying with tonight. After the line about flowers falling even though we love them, and weeds growing even though we dislike them, he continues. He says to study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by all things. This is the other direction the sentence about flowers was pointing. Most of us move through our days with a strong awareness of the self as the center around which everything else is organized. This is natural and in many ways necessary. It would be difficult to navigate a practical life without a reasonably stable sense of who you are and what you want and what belongs to you and what does not. The self is a useful instrument, but it also produces a particular kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of being the center. The effort of maintaining the sense that the world is organized around your preferences, your continuity, your survival. The way that exhaustion makes every change feel like a threat. Because change is always the world, refusing to stay organized around what you have decided it should be organized around. When Rujing said, dropping away of body and mind, and when Dogen felt something drop away in that room, this is what dropped. Not the body, not the mind. The insistence that the body and the mind are the fixed point around which everything else must be measured. And what replaced it was not nothing. What replaced it was what he described as being actualized by all things. The flower falling is not happening to you. From this view, you are part of the same movement as the flower. You and the flower are made of the same process, arising and passing, taking form and releasing form, present and then changed into something else. The falling is not an interruption of you. You are part of the falling. You always have been. This is very hard to hold in the mind as an idea. The mind wants to make it into a proposition and evaluate it and either agree or disagree. But it is not meant to be held in the mind as an idea. It is meant to be inhabited, the way you inhabit a room. Slowly, over time, with the body present, not just the thinking part. What Dogen found in that hall on Tiantong Mountain was the room. He spent 26 years describing its dimensions for anyone who wanted to find it. You are already in it. Tonight, the dropping away happens by itself in sleep. The insistence on being the center relaxes. The body softens into the surface it is lying on. The breath moves without anyone in charge of it. Every night, is a small version of what he found in China. You do not have to do anything with that. You only need to let the night do what it does. Rest here. Settle. The next story will wait for you. King Buddha stood in a forest after winning everything a man of his era could win. The silence that followed the victory was deeper than he expected. And in that silence, standing with his generals around him and the celebration beginning to organize itself somewhere behind him, he felt something he had no clear name for, something that rose in his chest and came out of his mouth as a sound that people heard from a distance and could not interpret at all. They came to the teacher afterward to ask, "Is this grief? Is this gratitude? Is this wisdom? What is a man doing when he wins everything and then stands in the forest and makes a sound that no one can name?" The answer was simpler than any of them expected. "And stranger." He had everything. That is the part the story keeps returning to. The way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, not because it is the most interesting part, but because it is the necessary part, the one that gives the rest of its meaning. Buddha had everything. Not almost everything. Not most things. Not a comfortable and generally fortunate arrangement that most people would call good enough. Everything. By the measure of the world he inhabited. By the standards of the kingdom he was born into, and had ruled with the particular authority of someone whose right to rule was not seriously questioned. He had arrived. He was born into the Sakyan clan, the same aristocratic family that had produced the man who would become the Buddha. Though the family was large, and the connection was distant enough that being of that lineage meant something in terms of standing and recognition, without meaning that anyone in particular watched over him. He grew up in comfort. He was educated in the way that men of his class and era were educated, in governance, in the management of people and territory and resources, in the arts of leadership that a person needs to maintain a position of power in a world where power is always contested at its edges. He became a king. Not through conquest, through the ordinary inheritance of a man whose family had held the position for generations. The way power passes from one hand to the next inside the same lineage until something interrupts the pattern. He administered his territory. He made the decisions that kings make, some of them good and some of them not. All of them requiring a certain quality of presence and authority that he had learned to maintain, whether he felt it or not. And then something happened that led to everything changing. The texts do not dwell on the details of the political situation, which is typical. The early Buddhist texts are generally more interested in the interior landscape of a person than in the external events that shaped it. What we know is that Buddha, at some point in his reign, came into contact with the community forming around the teacher in the deer park, and that this contact moved him in some way he could not have predicted. That he listened to the teachings, that something in the listening reached the place that royal administration and the management of a kingdom had not been able to reach. He gave up the throne. He ordained as a monk. He set down the apparatus of kingship, the decisions, the responsibilities, the constant awareness of being watched and assessed and depended upon, the weight of other people's welfare resting on the quality of your judgment on any given day. And he put on the robes and he went to live in the forest. The forests of that region of India in that era were not small. They were large, old forests, the kind that had been old for longer than anyone could accurately say, with a quality of depth and unmanageability that is difficult to communicate to anyone who has not spent significant time in them. They were not parks. They were not managed spaces where a person might walk and feel the pleasant sense of nature at a safe remove from ordinary life. They were genuinely wild in the way that forests are wild when they have not been shaped by human intention, when the things living in them do not particularly organize themselves around human comfort. He slept in them alone. The early monastic practice was austere in ways that the later tradition would soften. A monk went out with his bowl, ate what was given, found shelter where he could, and spent the hours of sitting and walking and sitting again with the whole of what he had been before present alongside what he was becoming. There was no comfortable monastery to return to at the end of the day. There was the forest, the dark, the sounds that forests make at night when the animals that move by night are moving. And in the mornings, from somewhere in the trees, the other monks heard a sound. He was saying something, repeating something, the way a person repeats something that has arrived in them and needs to come out again to be confirmed as real. The monks who were sleeping nearby would hear it, a voice, in the early morning dark before the light came, saying a phrase over and over with the quality of someone who cannot quite believe what they are saying. What happiness! What happiness! Oh, what happiness! They did not know what to make of it. The first thought was the obvious one, that this was a man mourning his former life. That the phrase being repeated in the dark was not genuine happiness but its opposite. The way people sometimes laugh when they are very far from laughing. The way the word fine can mean the complete reverse of itself. A man who had been a king, sleeping on the ground in the forest with his bowl and his robe, saying what happiness in the middle of the night. This seemed, to the monks who heard it, like the sound of someone who had made a large decision and was now facing the full weight of what it had cost. They went to the teacher. They said, "There is something wrong with Buddha. He is in the forest saying what happiness and we think it is grief." The teacher sent for Buddha. He came. He sat. The teacher asked him directly, "Is it true that you have been in the forest saying what happiness?" "It is true," Buddha said. "And what is in your mind when you say it?" Buddha was quiet for a moment. Not because he did not know the answer, but because the answer required him to go back to the thing he had been saying in the forest and look at it clearly in full daylight, which is a different experience from saying it in the dark. He said, "When I was king, there was fear. There was always fear. I had guards at the gates, and guards in the corridors, and guards in the rooms, and guards watching the guards. I ate at a full table, and I could not taste the food because part of my attention was always somewhere else, checking. I slept in a bed designed for comfort, and I could not rest the way a person rests when they are not holding anything, because I was always holding the kingdom, even in sleep. Even in the moments when you are supposed to be nowhere at all." He said, "I knew, in the general way that everyone knows things they do not look at directly, that all of this, the guards, the gates, the full table, the position, the authority, was not permanent. I knew it the way you know something that is true but inconvenient, which is to say I acknowledged it when it was mentioned and then moved my attention elsewhere as quickly as possible. Because to look at it directly was to feel the ground shift." He said, "Now I am in the forest. I have nothing that anyone would want to take. I have no gates. I have no position to maintain. I wake in the morning, and there is no one depending on the quality of my judgment before I have had a moment to simply be awake. The fear that was there every morning of my reign, arriving before I was fully conscious, has not arrived. For the first time in as long as I can remember, the morning is only the morning. He said, "What happiness?" The teacher listened. He did not say, "You are right to be happy," or "You are wrong to be happy," or "The happiness you are feeling is the correct kind of happiness," or "the incorrect kind." He said simply, "This is what it is." This is what the laying down feels like when you have been carrying something for a very long time. The happiness is real. The fear you lived with for years was real. The relationship between them is real. You have set down what you were carrying. And the body remembers what it is like not to carry it. And what happiness is the body saying something it has not been able to say for years. There is something in this exchange that I keep returning to, and it is not the happiness. It is the fear. Buddha was a king. He had every external advantage: the walls, the guards, the full table, the authority, the accumulated resources of a lineage. And underneath all of it, running steadily, was fear. The fear that it would change, that someone would take it, that the arrangement that seemed stable would reveal itself to be less stable than it appeared. The fear that is always present when you are holding something you cannot afford to lose. This is not a story about kings. It is a story about what happens when the thing you have organized your life around, the position, the relationship, the income, the sense of yourself as someone who has arrived at the particular arrangement of things that constitutes safety, is always underneath, accompanied by the awareness that it could change. Most of us carry this, not as a dramatic or obvious weight, as a background condition, the low hum of it underneath the days, the checking, the maintaining, the constant slight effort of keeping things as they are. The way that even in good moments, even in the full table moments, part of you is somewhere else, doing the calculation. Buddha was in the forest saying what happiness, not because the forest was better than the palace in any practical sense. The forest was harder. There was no table at all, full or otherwise. There was the bowl and whatever was placed in it. There was the ground and whatever the ground provided in terms of shelter and rest. What was absent was not difficulty. What was absent was the fear, because there was nothing left to lose in the same way. And the absence of that particular fear was so startling, so unexpected, so different from every morning of his previous life, that he kept needing to say it out loud. What happiness? What happiness? As if saying it was a way of confirming to himself that it was real, that this quality of morning, unremarkable, ungoverned, just the forest and the light coming through the trees and his own breathing and nothing requiring protection, was actually available to him, that he had not made a mistake, that he had set down exactly the right thing. This is what impermanence looks like from the inside, when you are no longer fighting it. Kisa Gotami walked toward impermanence without knowing that was where she was going. Buddha walked toward it deliberately, through a cemetery in the dark, asking questions no one could answer. Luang Pumun sat inside it for 50 years in the forests and charnel grounds. Dogen found its grammar in a room on Tiantong Mountain, and Buddha found it by setting down the thing he had been using to defend himself against it, and discovering that the ground was still there, that the morning was still there, that he was still there, and that without the weight of the defense, the morning had a quality he had never quite allowed himself to feel before. The birds in the forest do not know they are happy. The stream moving over the rocks does not know it is moving. The forest at dawn does not know that a former king is sitting in it, saying what happiness with tears on his face, or a smile on his face, or something that is not quite either, being witnessed by no one except the trees and the slowly arriving light. But he knew. That was enough. That is always enough. You are lying somewhere right now with the weight of whatever you have been carrying today still somewhere in the body. Some of it real concerns, real difficulties, real things that will still be present tomorrow and deserve attention. Some of it the maintenance, the checking, the holding, the background effort of keeping the arrangement of your life from shifting in the ways you are afraid it might shift. You do not have to set all of it down permanently tonight. You do not have to make a large decision about what you are holding and whether it serves you. That is not what sleep asks of you. Sleep only asks you to set it down for a few hours, to let the body be in the forest for a while, ungoverned, unheld, just breathing in the dark with no gates to maintain. You have been doing this every night of your life. You are good at it. The body knows how. Let the weight move to the edges. Let the breath move on its own. Let whatever morning is coming find you rested. Buddha was in the forest at dawn, the trees around him still, and the light coming slowly, and the sound of his own voice saying the thing his body finally knew. And it was enough. It was more than enough. The sixth story takes us to a place that is colder and higher, to Japan again, but a different Japan, a winter Japan, to a monk named Ryokan, who owned almost nothing, and who spent his life writing poems about snow and the moon and the way things disappear, and who met a thief one evening and responded in a way that nobody who heard about it quite knew how to explain. His story is a very short one on the surface. It is one of the longest ones underneath. Before we leave the forest and the former king, stay one more moment with what the monks misunderstood. They heard a man in the dark saying what happiness, and they were certain they knew what it meant. A man who had lost everything, performing contentment, or genuinely confused about his situation, or in some early stage of grief that had not yet arrived at the form grief usually takes. They brought their interpretation of him to the teacher before they had asked him a single question. The story they were telling themselves about him was already complete. This is something most of us do constantly, and almost always without knowing we are doing it. We hear someone in the forest making a sound, and we already know what the sound means. We see a person who has made a large change in their life, and we already know whether the change was wise. We encounter someone moving through difficulty, and we already know whether they are handling it correctly or incorrectly, whether what they are expressing is genuine or performed, whether the feeling they say they are having is the feeling they are actually having. We are usually wrong. Or not wrong exactly, but incomplete. Working from the surface and certain we have reached the depth. The monks were not bad people. They were genuinely concerned. They went to the teacher because they thought Buddha might need help, which is a kind impulse. But they went with the story already written, and the story was about grief and loss and the difficulty of making a large change in one life, because those were the stories they knew, and Buddha's situation seemed to fit one of them. What they had not done was sit with him in the forest in the morning and ask. The teacher sent for Buddha and asked. And what came out of Buddha's mouth in response to the direct question was not the story the monks had already written. It was something else entirely, something that required you to revise not just your understanding of Buddha, but your understanding of what happiness is and where it comes from and what it has to do with what you possess or do not possess. Happiness, the story suggests, is not a function of what you have. It is a function of what you are no longer trying to hold on to. This sounds, on first pass, like something people put on greeting cards, like wisdom of the motivational poster variety, the kind that sounds right until you try to live inside it. But Buddha was not making a philosophical argument. He was reporting an observation. He had been holding things for years, and then he had stopped holding them, and the difference in the quality of morning was so startling that he kept announcing it to the trees because there was nowhere else to announce it. The monks thought he was saying what happiness ironically, or in grief, or in confused denial. He was saying it the way a person says the name of something they have just seen for the first time, not as a declaration of belief, as a simple report. Here is what I notice. This is what this morning feels like. What happiness. There is a kind of rest that is available to you tonight that does not depend on anything changing. Not the situation that is still unresolved. Not the relationship that is still in its uncertain middle. Not the thing you are worried about that will still be there tomorrow. None of that needs to change for the rest to arrive. The rest is what happens when you stop holding, for a few hours, whatever you have been holding. The body does this by itself when you allow it to. The breath does this by itself. The mind, given the chance, will follow. Buddha was in the forest. You are in your room. The light coming through the trees and the darkness in your room are not so different at this hour. Both are simply the night doing what the night does. Both are waiting for you to stop checking and let the morning come on its own schedule. Let your hands be soft. Let your shoulders be heavy. Let whatever this day asked of you rest alongside you, not inside you, for the hours that remain. What happiness, the former king said, in the forest at dawn. What rest, the body says now, if you will let it. The sixth story takes us to a place that is colder and higher, to Japan again, but a different Japan, a winter Japan, to a monk named Ryakan, who owned almost nothing and who spent his life writing poems about snow and the moon and the way things disappear, and who met a thief one evening and responded in a way that nobody who heard about it quite knew how to explain. His story is a very short one on the surface. It is one of the longest ones underneath. The hut was small enough that you could stand in the middle of it and touch both walls without fully extending your arms. Ryokan had built it himself, or built it with help from the farmers in the valley below, who brought timber and left it at the edge of the clearing without being asked, because they knew he would not come to ask. He lived on the slope of Mount Kugami in the snow country of northwestern Japan, in a province called Echigo, where the winters come early and stay long, and the snow falls in quantities that people from other regions find difficult to believe until they see it. The snow that falls in Echigo does not fall the way snow falls in a city, in tentative flurries, in decorative dustings that are gone by midday. It falls with intention. It accumulates. By midwinter, the paths between villages become tunnels through drifts, and the mountains become white shapes that resemble the mountains they were in summer, but are something else entirely. He had lived in this hut for years. He was a monk of the Soto school of Japanese Zen, the same lineage as Dogen, the same tradition of just sitting, the same instruction to let the practice be the practice rather than a means to some other end. He had studied at a major training monastery in his 20s and 30s, had received transmission from his teacher, and had then done the thing that most monks do not do. He had gone away from the institutional world of Buddhism almost entirely, had climbed his mountain, had built his small hut, and had lived there on the edge of ordinary village life in a way that was neither quite monastic nor quite lay, that fit into none of the available categories and therefore suited him perfectly. He begged. He walked down the mountain to the villages in the valley with his bowl, and he received whatever was given. He was not good at begging in the way that efficient begging requires, the dignified presence, the economy of movement, the discipline of not becoming attached to the village itself, to the particular family that gave generously, to the smell of the kitchen at a house you have been visiting for years. He was too interested in people. He stopped and talked. He played with the children he met on the roads, the kind of play that adults generally consider beneath their dignity, hand games, simple contests, the sort of thing that requires a person to be genuinely present rather than performing presence. He lost track of time doing it. He was frequently late back to the mountain. He wrote poems. This was the other thing that organized his days. Alongside the sitting and the begging and the occasional conversation that stretched into the evening, because neither person could quite find the right moment to stop. He wrote them in a style that the Japanese called haiku and tanka, short forms, disciplined forms, forms that force you to find the weight in a very small number of words. He wrote about the moon a great deal. He wrote about snow. He wrote about the stream near the hut and the birds he could hear from inside when he was sitting, and the sound the wind makes in the pines when it comes from a particular direction, and the way the light changes in the early morning, and the way it changes again just before dark, and the particular quality of certain kinds of silence. He wrote about impermanence constantly, the way people write about the thing they are spending their life learning to understand. Not as a topic he had mastered and was now reporting from the far side of, as something he was inside, still, that kept showing him new surfaces. He owned very little. This was partly by choice and partly by circumstance. The hut on the mountain was not a place that accumulated things easily, and he had no strong attachment to accumulating them, and the life he was living did not generate the resources that accumulation requires. He had his robes, which were worn and patched, and had been repaired enough times that the patches themselves now had patches. He had his bowl. He had his writing materials. He had a few objects that people had given him over the years, small things, meaningful to the givers, kept because it would have been unkind to lose them. One night in autumn, while he was away from the hut, or sleeping deeply enough that he did not hear the door, a thief came in. The thief went through the hut with whatever efficiency thieves bring to the work of finding what is takeable. He looked in the corners. He examined what was on the shelves. He moved through the small space that was the whole of Ryokan's domestic world, looking for the thing worth taking. There was very little. The texts do not tell us whether the thief was disappointed or simply pragmatic about it. Thieves who operate in the margins of village life in rural Japan in the 18th century were accustomed to the arithmetic of poverty, to huts that contained approximately what a hut on the slope of a mountain with a monk in it might be expected to contain. But he took what there was to take, which was not much, and he was leaving when Ryokan woke, or emerged from wherever he had been. Ryokan looked at the thief. He looked at what the thief had found, which was minimal. He looked at the thief again. He took off his robe. He held it out. He said, or the tradition says he said, "These things travel in the form of poetry as often as in the form of prose." So the exact words are uncertain. Something to the effect that the thief should take this too. That it would have been a shame to come all this way and leave without the best thing in the hut. The thief took the robe. He left. Ryokan sat in his hut in the dark, without the robe, in the cold. The autumn nights on Mount Kugami are not warm nights. He sat for a while and looked at what remained, which was the moon through the open door, or through the window, depending on which version of the story you are reading. And then he wrote a poem. The poem, in the version that has been translated most often into English, says something like the thief left it behind, the moon in the window. It is not a long poem. It does not elaborate. It does not explain what Ryokan felt about the theft, or about giving away his robe, or about sitting in the cold afterward. It simply observes, he came. He took what he could carry, and what he left behind was the moon. People have been sitting with this poem for 250 years. What is it saying? One way to approach it is the obvious way the thief took material things and left behind something that cannot be taken. The moon is not ownable. You cannot put it in a bag and carry it away. It is there for everyone or no one, indifferent to the question of possession, ancient and indifferent and present, regardless of what is or is not in the hut below it. The thief inadvertently performed a kind of clarification. He removed what was removable, and the moon remained, demonstrating exactly what the moon had always been demonstrating, which is that some things are not subject to the logic of taking and losing. This is true and worth sitting with, but it is not quite the whole of what the poem is doing. Another way is to notice what Ryokan chose to do when the thief was leaving. He did not shout. He did not chase. He did not perform the suffering of a man who has just been robbed, because he was not, in any sense that felt primary to him, suffering. He saw a person who had come to his mountain in the night looking for something, and he gave that person the thing that was most worth giving, not out of passivity or defeat, out of a quality of attention that recognized something about what the thief actually needed, which was probably not the robe, though it was the robe he left with. This is the part of the story that resists summary. The giving of the robe is not the act of a man who has decided that possessions do not matter and is demonstrating his detachment. It is something else, a quality of meeting, a quality of seeing, that is very difficult to perform and almost impossible to teach directly. It is the quality that Buddha was pointing toward in the forest when he said what happiness, not the absence of things, but the absence of the grip that turns things into what you cannot afford to lose. Ryokan was not attached to the robe. This is clear. But that is the least interesting thing about the story. The more interesting thing is what he was attached to, which was the person standing in his hut, holding his few possessions, and the desire that person had, and the gap between what the thief was looking for and what the thief was going to find in the bag he carried away from the mountain. The moon was always going to be there. The thief was not going to find the moon in the robe. The poem is, among other things, a gentle and enormous sadness about that. He spent the rest of his life on that mountain, writing poems about snow and the moon and the stream, and the way impermanence moved through every ordinary hour of a life lived in close attention. He wrote a poem near the end of his life that people still read at funerals in Japan, though it was not written for a funeral. It says something about the world of dew, that it is a world of dew and therefore, and then it pauses there, in the way that good poems pause, leaving the conclusion for you to complete. A world of dew, and therefore, whatever you understand from that, whatever weight the therefore carries for you at this particular moment in your particular life, a world of dew, and therefore, he was not telling you what to feel about that. He was not instructing you to accept it, or to be at peace with it, or to incorporate it into a philosophy of detachment. He was only pointing at it, the way he pointed at the moon. The way the moon itself is a kind of pointing at something the moon is not quite able to say. There is a quality about Ryokan's life that I find very difficult to describe and very easy to feel. At this hour, in the particular silence of late night, he was not trying to be remarkable. He was not, as far as anyone could tell, performing his poverty or his simplicity or his habit of playing with children on the road. He was simply living very close to things, close to the cold in winter and the snow that accumulated on the mountain and the sound of the water in the stream near the hut and the faces of the people in the villages who gave him rice or did not. Close to the way things change and the way they look when you stop organizing your perception of them around what you need them to be. This closeness is what the poems came out of. Not wisdom that was then translated into images, but images that arrived first: the moon, the dew, the snow, the thief leaving in the night, and the wisdom that was latent in the images, that you find by sitting with the image long enough. The thief left it behind, the moon in the window. What the thief did not take is what was always there. What you cannot lose is what you have always had. This is the thing all 9 of these stories are pointing at from different angles, the thing that Kisagatami was reaching toward on that road between doors, the thing that Buddha found in the cemetery in the dark, the thing Luang Pu Man was cultivating in the forests for 50 years. The thing Dogen found in a room in China when something dropped away. What you cannot take from a person is not their robe, and not their bowl, and not their hut on the mountain. What you cannot take is the moon. And the moon, in every version of this story, is already present. Already there. Not something to be attained. Not something to be protected. Just present, whether you are looking at it or not, whether the thief has come or has not, whether the robe is on your back or in someone else's bag. You have not been robbed of it. You cannot be. It is there in the room with you right now. If you are very quiet, let your breath come and go with no effort. Let the weight of the day be what it is, and let it rest beside you rather than inside you. You have carried enough for today. The night is doing what the night does, which is simply to hold you while the rest happens on its own. The 7th story travels across water again, but shorter water this time, to China, to the 9th century, to a monk named Linji, who was famous for doing something to his students that students generally do not expect from their teachers, and to a question that was asked in front of him that seemed, on the surface, to have an obvious answer, and to what he did instead of answering it. His story is about silence, about the thing that cannot be said, and about what happens when the moment arrives and the only honest response is to do something other than speak. Before we leave the mountain and the monk and the moon in the window, there is one more thing his life holds that is worth staying with in the dark. Ryokan was not serene in the way that word is sometimes used to mean distant. uninvested, above the fray of ordinary human experience. He was the opposite. He was exquisitely present to the ordinary. He wept at things. The records from the people who knew him and wrote about him after his death describe a man who laughed easily and grieved genuinely and was moved by small things in ways that could have seemed excessive if they had not been so clearly real. He wept once. The stories say, when he was playing with a child and the child had to go inside for the evening. Not a dramatic weeping, a quiet one. The kind that happens when you are in the middle of something genuinely good and the end of it arrives before you are ready. The child had to go in. Ryokan stood at the edge of the road alone for a moment. This is not what distance from things looks like. This is what full presence looks like. The capacity to be completely in the game and to feel the ending of the game completely when the ending comes. The willingness to let the good thing be as good as it is, which includes letting its ending be as real as it is. This is different from what most of us usually do. Most of us manage the ending of good things by not quite being fully in them, by holding something in reserve, by maintaining a slight distance from the pleasure, by never quite arriving completely in the good moments so that when the moment ends, we have not lost as much. It is a kind of self-protection. Reasonable, understandable, and it means that the good things are never quite as good as they could be, because we are never quite fully inside them. Ryokan played with children on the roads, with his whole self available. He sat with the moon, with his whole self available. He gave his robe to the thief with his whole self available. And when things ended, when the child went inside, when the thief disappeared down the mountain, when the autumn turned into winter and the cold became serious, he felt the ending the way. You can only feel it when you were genuinely present in the thing that ended. What happiness, Buddha said in the forest. What sadness, and what happiness, Ryokan might have said. At the same time, for the same reason, this is the strange logic of impermanence fully inhabited. The things that are most beautiful are the things that change. The moments that are most fully alive are the ones that are already becoming something else. The moon in the window after the thief has left is the same moon that was there before he arrived. But Ryokan sees it differently now. It has been clarified by what it is not. It remains by not being removable. It shines with the particular brightness of a thing that cannot be reduced. You are already in the middle of something that is passing. This moment, this breath, this particular arrangement of the dark in the room, and the weight of the surface beneath you, and the sound of whatever is or is not audible from where you are, is already becoming the next moment. This is not sad. It is not frightening. It is simply what it is. The moon in the window is there whether you are looking at it or not. Let your hands be open. Let your jaw soften. Let the breath find its own rhythm without any effort from you. Ryokan lived on his mountain into old age, writing poems about snow and dew and the moon, playing with children on the roads when there were children on the roads, sitting in the hut when there were no children and the snow was deep and the only sound was the wind in the pines and the small interior silence of a person who has learned, over a long lifetime, to be present with what is here and not absent with what is not. He was good at that, not because he was extraordinary, because he practiced. You are practicing right now, in your own way, without knowing that is what you are doing. The breath moving in and out without effort, the body releasing what it held through the day, the mind beginning to let go of the edges of things. This is the practice. This is all it ever is. The seventh story travels to China, to the 9th century, to a monk named Linji, who was famous for doing something to his students that students generally do not expect from their teachers, and to a question that was asked in front of him that seemed, on the surface, to have an obvious answer, and to what he did instead of answering it. His story is about silence, about the thing that cannot be said, and about what happens when the moment arrives and the only honest response is to do something other than speak. His students were afraid of him, not in the way that a person is afraid of someone dangerous, though that is how it sometimes looked from outside. Not in the way that a person is afraid of something cruel. In a different way, the way you are afraid of the moment just before something inside you changes, when you can feel the change coming and you cannot tell whether it will hurt or free you or both at once, and you are not sure there is a difference. Linji was the abbot of a monastery in the Hebei region of China during the Tang dynasty. In the 9th century, when Chinese Chan Buddhism was at a particular kind of flowering, the teachers of that era were doing something different from what teachers had done before them, or different, at least in degree and intensity. They were trying to jolt students out of conceptual thinking, out of the comfortable habit of replacing direct experience with ideas about direct experience, and they were willing to use means that were not gentle. Linji was among the most famous practitioners of this. He shouted. He struck. He gave answers to questions that were not answers in any conventional sense, that left the student more confused than before, or suddenly less confused in a way that was difficult to explain. He had a particular shout, a shout so well known that it is still referenced in Buddhist texts today, usually transliterated as the sound of a single syllable. The kind of sound that a body makes when it has nothing to say and says that instead. He was trying to interrupt something, to break the loop of the thinking mind long enough for the thing underneath thinking to surface. The thinking mind is very good at processing. It takes in information and it sorts it, and it produces responses, and it keeps the machinery of understanding going at all hours. This is enormously useful for navigating the world. It is also, if you identify entirely with it, a kind of prison, because the thinking mind cannot stop thinking any more than the eye can stop seeing. It processes experience, and in processing it, reduces it. It turns the thing into a thought about the thing, the moon into an idea of the moon, the robe into the concept of the robe, the grief into a narrative about grief, the moment into a memory of the moment before the moment is over. Linji wanted his students to stop being the processing and start being the processed. He was not, in the records the tradition kept of him, a gentle man. The records describe someone sharp, direct, impatient with self-deception in the particular way that people who have spent years working through their own self-deception become impatient with it in others. Not unkindly, but without the patience to wait while someone takes a long and comfortable route to a recognition that a shorter, the harder path would arrive at faster. One day, a student stood before him and asked a question. The question was simple, almost embarrassingly simple, for a formal encounter between a monk and an abbot in a Zen monastery. The student asked, "What is the permanent within the impermanent?" This is a real question. It is not a beginner's question dressed up in sophisticated clothing. It is the question that sits underneath every story in this collection tonight. The thing that Kisa Gotami was reaching for when she went from door to door. The thing Buddha was asking in the cemetery. The thing that arrived in Dogen's room on Tiantong Mountain and could not be put cleanly into words. What is permanent? If everything changes? If nothing holds still? If even the mountains are moving slowly, and the stars are moving and the cells of the body replace themselves, and the mind that woke this morning is not quite the same mind that went to sleep last night? If all of that is true, then is there anything that does not move, anything that is here before the change and still hereafter? It is a genuine question. It deserves a genuine answer. Linji did not speak. He struck his staff against the floor. One impact. A sound that moved through the hall and then was gone, absorbed into the walls and the air and the silence that came back after. The kind of sound that you feel as much as hear, that goes into the body before the mind has time to process it. The student stood there. The sound was gone. Linji was looking at him. There was nothing else. This is not an answer in the way that an answer usually works. It does not contain information. It does not advance an argument. It does not define terms or lay out a structure of logic that the student can follow from one room to the next until he arrives at the conclusion. There is no conclusion. There is a sound in a room, and then the absence of the sound and the student standing in the silence trying to understand what just happened. What Linji was pointing at is this. The question asks for the permanent within the impermanent, as though these are two different things. As though impermanence is the surface and permanence is what lies beneath it. The stable thing underneath the changing thing. The ground that doesn't move under the ground that moves. As though finding the permanent requires penetrating through the impermanent to get to what is hidden behind it. But the strike against the floor does not penetrate anything. It arrives. It is completely present. And then it passes. And what is permanent in that, if anything is not something behind the sound. It is something in the quality of the arriving. The full presence of the moment before it becomes memory. The thing itself before it is processed. You cannot think your way to this. Linji knew this. He had tried thinking his way to it and had received enough strikes and shouts from his own teacher to understand that thinking always arrives a step too late. By the time thought has formed around an experience, the experience has already moved into something else. The thought is a report from a place the body has already left. The strike against the floor says here, now, before you process this, before you decide what it means, just this, the sound and the silence after it, and the student standing in the hall, and the afternoon light coming through the high windows, and the breath in the body, and the weight of the floor under the feet. Just this is the answer. Not because the impermanence does not exist, or the question was wrongly asked, but because the permanent is not behind the impermanent. It is the impermanence itself, fully arrived at, not resisted, not translated into a concept, not held at the distance of processing. The moment that is completely met. This can sound like a philosophy. It is not a philosophy. A philosophy is something the mind can hold and examine and carry from one conversation to the next. This is something different. It is closer to what Buddha was feeling in the forest when there was no longer anything to guard, and what Ryokan was experiencing in his hut after the thief had come and gone, and the only thing left in the room was the moon and the cold and the particular quality of being right here with nothing between him and the night. Linji's students learned, over years of sitting with him, to stop waiting for the answer that the question seemed to call for. They learned that when the answer arrived, it would not look like an answer. It would look like a sound in a room. It would look like silence. It would look like an ordinary moment so completely itself that it could not be carried away and examined at a distance, only lived in while it was happening. Most of us spend most of our time not quite living in what is happening. We are in the processing layer, managing our experience, interpreting it, comparing it to other experiences, deciding what it means and how we feel about it and what it portends and what we should do about it. This is not wrong. This is the necessary equipment of a functioning human life in a world that requires navigation. But it is also, when it never stops, a kind of permanent lateness. The moment arrives and we meet its processed version. The person speaks and we are already formulating our response while the words are still arriving. The beauty appears and we are already thinking the word beautiful, already organizing the experience into a form that can be described later, already subtly gone from where the beauty is. Linji's shout and his strike against the floor were attempts to interrupt this, to catch the student in the moment before the processing had time to complete, the moment of pure arrival, before the arrival became a thought about arrival. That moment is, in the Zen understanding, not an experience of enlightenment as something extraordinary and rare. It is simply the experience of being where you are, fully, without distance. You are doing this right now, in the drift towards sleep. The processing layer is quieting. The mind is releasing its grip on the day's events, on the things that still need to be figured out, on the plans and the worries and the small, unresolved frictions of ordinary life. The body is present in a way it rarely is during the waking hours. Weight on the surface, breath moving, temperature of the room against the skin. The processing is slowing. What remains is closer to what Linji was pointing at with his strike against the floor. Just this. Just here. Sleep is the great equalizer of all the stories tonight. Kisa Gotami and Buddha, and Luang Pumun, and Dogen and Badia and Ryokan and Linji himself, all of them, for all the depth and difficulty and genuine attainment of their waking lives, were not exempt from sleep. Their bodies required it. Every night they lay down and the processing stopped and something more fundamental took over, something that does not know the difference between a king and a thief, between the robe and the moon, between the question and the strike against the floor. Sleep knows nothing about permanence and impermanence. It simply arrives when the body is ready and does what it does, and then recedes and the person wakes, changed in ways they cannot fully account for, rested by something that cannot be explained by the activities that preceded it. You are at that edge now. The edge where the story ends and something else begins that has no story in it. The strike against the floor has already sounded. The silence after it is where you are. Let it be what it is. Let the processing finish on its own schedule while you rest. Let the question, whatever question you have brought into this night, sit with its answer still pending, still forming, arriving in its own time without your effort. Just this. Just here. Just the breath and the dark and the weight of where you are resting. The eighth story is nearly the last, and it is a short one on its own terms. It takes us to a different kind of question. Not the question asked aloud in a hall in front of a teacher, but the question a man carried for most of his life before he found the right moment to ask it, and the way the asking itself turned out to be the answer. His name was Huang Bo. He was Linji's teacher, and there is something in the record of one conversation between them that I have been thinking about for years without feeling that I have reached the bottom of it. Before the 8th story, let this one breathe a little longer. There is something about Linji that is easy to misread because of the reputation. The shouts, the strikes, the way his teaching method has been described over the centuries in terms that emphasize its abruptness, its violence, its refusal to be comfortable. People encounter this description and form a picture of a harsh teacher, someone whose approach requires a certain tolerance for being unsettled, someone not particularly suited to the quiet hours before sleep. But the record of what he actually said, not just what he did, but the lectures that his students wrote down, the conversations that were preserved in the text, called the Record of Linji, reveals something different underneath the method. Something very gentle, if you read it slowly enough. He said when hungry, eat. When tired, sleep. He said this in the context of a longer teaching about the ordinary nature of enlightenment, about the way people search through mountains of text and years of elaborate practice for something they are doing correctly every time they sleep and wake and eat and breathe without thinking about it. The naturalness of it. The way it does not require achievement or special condition or the correct orientation of the mind. Just when hungry, eat. When tired, sleep. This is what the strike against the floor was pointing at. Not some elevated state requiring years of preparation to access. The thing that is already happening. The breathing that is already occurring without your management. The body that is already doing what bodies do, taking in what it needs, releasing what it does not, moving through time with a naturalness that the thinking mind, with all its analysis and planning and self-monitoring, can never quite replicate or improve upon. When he struck the floor, he was interrupting the student's search for something more complicated than what was already present. The question, what is the permanent within the impermanent, was already assuming that permanent and impermanent are two different territories, and that the work is to get from one to the other. Linji's strike said you are already in both. You have never been anywhere else. The sound of the strike was impermanent. It arrived and it passed. The hearing of the sound, the space in which the sound occurred, the quality of presence in the room before and during and after, this was not impermanent in the same way. Not because it was some different substance, some metaphysical permanence hiding behind the physical world, but because it was not the kind of thing that arises and passes the way a sound arises and passes. It was the space in which arising and passing happen. It was what was there before the sound and what was there after, unchanged by the sound's arrival or departure. He was not pointing to this as a concept. He was pointing to it as the room you are already standing in. Most of the effort we spend thinking about impermanence, the anxiety it produces, the grief it produces, the resistance, comes from the assumption that we are the things that are impermanent, that we are the sound, not the space in which the sound occurs, that we are the arrangement of thoughts and feelings and habits and roles that constitute what we call ourselves, and that when those arrangements change, when the role ends, when the feeling passes, when the person you thought you were becomes someone you do not quite recognize, Something essential has been lost. But what Linji was pointing at, when he struck the floor and said nothing, was something prior to all of those arrangements. Something that was there when you were very young and did not yet have the full apparatus of self-concept in place, and will be there when you are very old and the apparatus has begun to simplify, and is there right now underneath the complexity of being the person you have become. It does not require your protection. It does not require your maintenance. It does not need to be found or established or defended. It is the space in which every sound occurs, including the sound of the world telling you that you are not enough, or that something important is ending, or that you have made irreversible mistakes, or that there is a version of this life you should have lived instead of this one. Those sounds arrive. They are real. They have weight. And they occur in something that is not disturbed by their arrival. The room where the student was standing when Linji struck the floor was not changed by the strike. The walls were the same. The air was the same. The afternoon light was the same. The student's body was the same. What changed was the atmosphere of the moment, the slight shock, the interruption of the processing, the sudden presence, and then the silence afterward, which was the same silence as before, only now the student could hear it. You are in that room right now. Not metaphorically. The room where you are resting is that room. The silence around your breathing is that silence. The thing that remains when the processing quiets down, which it is doing now, at this hour, is the thing that was always there. When tired, sleep. Linji said this. He was not offering a consolation or a simplification. He was saying, trust what the body knows. The body knows when it is hungry, and when it is tired, and when it needs warmth, and when it needs silence. The body is not confused about impermanence. The body is impermanence. It changes every second of every day without asking your permission or your opinion. And it does so with a grace and a naturalness that no amount of thinking about impermanence has ever improved upon. Let the body lead. Tonight. It knows the way. The breath is already doing it. The muscles are already beginning the long release that happens every night when the holding of the day is given permission to stop. The eyes behind the closed lids are already going still. Something you cannot name is already moving in the direction of rest, has been moving toward it all evening. You will continue moving toward it, whether you help or hinder. You are in the room. The silence is the room. The strike against the floor has already sounded and is already gone. Just this. Just here. The 8th story is nearly the last, and it takes us to a different kind of question, not the question asked aloud in a hall, but the question a man named Huangbo carried for years before he found the right moment to ask it, and the way the asking itself turned out to be the answer. Huangbo was Linji's teacher. He was the one who formed Linji, who gave him the method, who sat with him for years while Linji was still looking for what he had come to find. There is a conversation between them in the record that I return to often. A small exchange, almost nothing on the surface, that opens differently every time I find it again. He was extraordinarily tall. This is one of the few biographical facts that the records preserve about Huangbo Siyun. Not the year of his birth, not the name of his father, not the village in Fujian province where he grew up, and where some temple had taken him in as a young man and given him the robes and the shaved head in the beginning of the practice. Most of that is gone. What the records kept is that he was unusually tall, and that he had a distinctive protrusion on his forehead that the tradition took as a mark of someone set apart from ordinary possibility. And the teachings, they kept the teachings. He began his monastic life on a mountain that would give him his name, Mount Huangbo in Fujian, the province on the southeastern coast, where the cliffs drop toward the sea and the air has a particular quality in the mornings. Salt and pine together, the smell of a world that is very old. He left that mountain the way young monks of serious intention leave the places where they begin, not because those places have failed him, but because the practice requires more than any single place can provide. He needed to find the teachers who could answer what he had not yet been able to answer, and those teachers were not all in one location. He traveled. He studied. He came eventually to Baizhang, who was one of the great Chan masters of the era, and he studied with Baizhang for years, and what he received there became the foundation of everything he would later teach. He received Dharma transmission, the direct passing of understanding from one mind to another in the way the Chan tradition understood transmission, not as the transfer of information, but as the recognition of something that was already present. He was certified, in the language the tradition uses, as someone who had genuinely seen what was there to be seen. He established his own teaching center eventually, in Jiangxi province, and students came. Many of them. The word moves through any world, including the world of 9th century Tang dynasty China. When a teacher is doing something real rather than performing the appearance of it. They came because what he said had a quality of arriving from somewhere other than preparation and performance. It arrived from whatever he had found on those mountains and in those years of sitting, and it landed in the people who heard it with the particular weight of something that is true rather than merely well constructed. One of the people who came was not a monk. He was a minister of state. His name was Pei Xiu, and he was one of the most powerful government officials of the Tang dynasty, a man who operated in the world of power and policy and court politics, who had access to the structures of authority that organized the empire, who moved through rooms where decisions were made that affected millions of lives. He was also a devout Buddhist, which in the world of Tang dynasty China was not a contradiction. Many of the most powerful men of that era were practitioners. The religion and the state were not cleanly separate territories. He came to Huangbo because he was drawn by the teaching, not as a cultural matter, not as a formal observance of the appropriate religious affiliations of a man of his standing. He came because something in the teaching called to something in him that his position and his influence and his access to power had not been able to satisfy. He sat with Huangbo. He listened. He came back. Over time, he became one of Huangbo's most committed lay students. And when Huangbo died, Pei Xiu was one of the people who wrote down what had been said, who preserved the teachings in the form that has survived to the present. The record that carries Huangbo's teachings is partly a record of conversations between the two of them, an official and a monk, a man who controlled things and a man who had released the need to control anything. Two people who were interested in the same questions from different directions, and whose conversations produced something that neither of them alone would have produced. One day, Pei Xiu asked Huangbo a question. The question was simple and enormous and very old. People had been asking it in every tradition, across every culture, for as long as there had been people who could form the question. He asked, when an enlightened master dies, where does he go? It is worth pausing here to notice that this is a different question from the ones in the preceding stories. Kisa Gautami's question was about the individual grief of her own situation. Buddha's question in the cemetery was about what the death of a body means. The student in front of Linji was asking about the permanent within the impermanent. But Pei Xiu's question had a specific object. Not death in general. Not impermanence in general. The enlightened master, the person who has spent a life moving toward understanding, the person whose life has been organized around the question of what is real and what is passing. When that person's body stops and the breath leaves and the thing that was Huangbo is no longer in the room, where has it gone? There is grief underneath this question. The grief of a student who knows his teacher is aging, who knows the conversations will one day stop being possible, who wants to know that what has been most real about the teacher, the quality of presence, the understanding, the thing that made the room feel different when Huangbo was in it, is not simply cancelled by the body's ending. And there is something else underneath the grief. A genuine philosophical inquiry into the nature of what a person is. If impermanence is the nature of all things, if nothing holds its form, if the forms keep changing into other forms, then what is Huangbo, the tall man from Fujian province? Yes, the teacher with the distinctive forehead, the man who shouted and struck and occasionally spoke with a gentleness that landed differently than the shouts did. All of that is a form, and the form will end. So what remains? Huangbo looked at him. He said, I do not know. Pei Xiu was surprised. He said, but you are a Chan master. How can you not know? Huangbo said, yes, and I do not know. Then he said something else, or the tradition preserves something else that came after. And it is this second part that I have been returning to for years. He said, if I knew, I would not be afraid. Let that settle for a moment. A Chan master, one of the most respected Buddhist teachers of the Tang dynasty, a man who had spent his entire adult life in the investigation of the nature of mind and the nature of reality and the nature of what it means to be alive and what it means for that being alive to stop. A man who had received transmission from one of the great teachers of the era, who had himself transmitted to Linji, who would go on to become one of the defining figures of the entire Chan tradition. This man, when asked where the enlightened go when they die, said, I do not know. And if I knew, I would not be afraid. The honest answer, not the reassuring one. This is what lifts the exchange out of the ordinary and into the territory this collection of stories has been moving through all night. Not the philosophical answer, not the theological answer, not the answer that would make Pei Xiu feel better about the eventual ending of the teacher he loved. The true answer, which is that the question does not have an answer that can be given in words, and that claiming to have such an answer would require Huangbo to perform a certainty he did not have, and that performing that certainty would be a kind of lying, and that Huangbo was not willing to lie even in the service of comfort. I do not know, and if I knew, I would not be afraid. What does he mean by afraid? He was not, by any account from the tradition that knew him, a frightened man. He had spent decades investigating exactly this territory, the nature of what arises and passes, the question of what is underneath the arising and passing, the quality of presence that the Chan tradition was pointing toward. He had been inside this for years. And yet, if I knew, I would not be afraid. He means something precise by this. He is not confessing to chronic anxiety or to a failure of his own practice. He is observing something about the relationship between genuine living and the question of what comes after. That to be alive, genuinely alive, in the full presence that his years of practice had opened him to, is to be in some relationship with not knowing. That certainty about what comes after would require a kind of standing outside the process that genuine engagement with the process does not permit. The moon in Ryokan's window was not certain about its own permanence. Buddha in the forest was not certain about anything except the quality of the morning. Kisagotami, sitting at the roadside with her empty hands, knew something. She knew that there was no house free from loss, but she did not know what lay beyond the knowing. Dogen wrote for 26 years about something that language could not contain. Luang Pu Mun sat in the charnel grounds for decades with the not knowing present in every session, and called what he found there the deepest practice. Not knowing is not a failure of the investigation. It is a quality of genuine investigation. The person who is certain about what comes after is probably not paying attention to the full weight of the question. The person who is afraid, in Huangbo's precise sense, is alive to it, is not looking away, is in the room with the question the way Ryokan was in the room with the moon. Pei Xiu preserved this conversation. He wrote it down because he understood, even in the moment of receiving an answer that was not the answer he had hoped for, that what he had just received was more valuable than reassurance. He had hoped for certainty and received honesty. He had wanted to know where the master goes and was told that the master, like everyone else, does not know. And somehow that not knowing, spoken plainly and without apology, was the most comforting thing Pei Xiu had ever heard, because it meant that he and Huangbo were in the same place, separated by years of practice and depth of understanding. Yes, but both of them standing at the same edge, looking at the same question, honest about what the question contains. The master did not know any more than the student. In this particular way, the practice had not produced certainty. It had produced the capacity to remain in the presence of not knowing without being destroyed by it, which is something different and perhaps more useful. You do not need to know tonight where anything goes. You do not need to have resolved the question that Pei Xiu brought to that room. The question is real and the not knowing is real, and both of them can be here with you in the dark, neither answered nor dismissed. Simply present, the way the questions you carry are always present, underneath the surface of the day, waiting. The practice, if there is a practice that these 9 stories have been moving toward, is not the achievement of certainty. It is the development of the capacity to remain fully in the presence of what cannot be known, to stay in the room, to not require the question to be answered before you are willing to rest. Huangbo did not know where the enlightened go when they die. He said so plainly to one of the most powerful men in China, without embarrassment or apology. And then he continued teaching. He continued sitting. He continued sending students like Linji into the world with the method and the transmission and the not knowing at the center of everything. He continued, fully and genuinely, in the presence of the unresolved. That continuing is the teaching, not the answer. The continuing, you are continuing right now. Through the night, through whatever you have been carrying, through the questions that do not yet have the answers they will eventually have. The continuation is not a performance of resilience. It is simply the breath, and the dark, and the body doing what bodies do, and the night doing what the night does. Let your breath be slow now. Let the questions rest where they are, unresolved and unthreatening, companions in the dark rather than demands. The ninth and final story is the shortest of all. It is about Ajahn Thate, a Thai forest monk who sat in the forest one night and followed his mind to the very edge of something, and then came back. And what he understood from the coming back was different from what he had understood before. It is a story about the threshold, about standing at the place where one thing becomes another, and what you learn there that you could not have learned any other way. You are almost there yourself. Tonight, the threshold is close. Let it come. Before we move to the final story, stay here a moment with the minister and the monk. Pei Xiu was not a man who was unacquainted with death. He had lived in the court of the Tang dynasty through decades of political upheaval, through the era that included the great persecution of Buddhism in 845, when the emperor at the time ordered monasteries destroyed and monks defrocked, and the institutional structures of the religion dismantled with an efficiency that religious persecutions rarely achieve completely, but this one came close to. Pei Xiu had watched things end that seemed permanent. He had watched people who seemed certain of their positions lose them overnight. He had been, in other words, inside the impermanence of human arrangements at a scale that most people do not experience. And still the question arrived. Still, when he sat with Huangbo and felt the quality of presence that the teacher brought to the room, he wanted to know that this particular thing, this particular quality, this person, this relationship was not simply going to stop. This is not a failure of philosophical sophistication. This is what it means to love something. To value the specific form of a specific thing rather than valuing impermanence in the abstract as a concept you agree with. Pei Xiu did not need to be taught that things change. He knew this. He had watched the monasteries burn. What he needed, what the question was really asking, was some assurance that what he had found in Huangbo's teaching was not the same kind of thing as the monasteries. That there was something here that did not depend on the continued existence of the physical teacher for its continuation in him. Huangbo's answer gave him this. Not by providing the reassurance he asked for, but by modeling the thing he was afraid of losing. He showed Pei Xiu what it looked like to remain fully present in the face of not knowing. He did not protect himself from the question by retreating behind a doctrine or a formula or an authoritative statement about the nature of the afterlife in Buddhist cosmology. He stayed in the room with the question and said plainly, "I do not know." And in that plainness, in that willingness to be a master and also a person at the edge of the same mystery as everyone else, he demonstrated exactly what he had been teaching for decades. The quality does not depend on certainty. The presence does not depend on having the answer. The thing Pei Xiu had found in those years of sitting with Huangbo, the quality of attention, the capacity to remain, the way of meeting the moment without flinching, none of that required knowing where anything went after the breath stopped. It required exactly this, the honesty to say, "I do not know," and the stability to continue anyway. This is what Pei Xiu preserved when he wrote down the conversations. Not a record of a teacher who had all the answers. A record of a teacher who was honest about which questions had no answers, and who found that honesty more useful than any amount of false certainty. That is the thing worth carrying tonight, not the resolution of the question about what happens after, not the certainty about what is permanent and what is not, but the capacity to remain in the presence of what cannot be resolved, without the not resolving destroying what is good about being here. The night outside is doing what nights do in whatever season you are in. The world is changing at the rate it always changes, which is continuous and unhurried and completely indifferent to whether you are watching or not. Your body is doing what it does, breathing, shifting slightly, the temperature adjusting, something in the muscles releasing that had been held since morning. You do not need to know where anything goes to let this night be what it is. Huangbo did not know. He said so. He continued. You continue too. In the breath, in the dark, in the particular not knowing of this hour. The ninth and final story is the shortest of all. It is about Ajahn Thate, a Thai forest monk who sat in the forest one night and followed his mind to the very edge of something, and then came back. And what he understood from the coming back was different from what he had understood before. It is a story about the threshold, about standing at the place where one thing becomes another, and what you learn there that you could not have learned any other way. You are almost there yourself, tonight. The threshold is close. Let it come. He had been following his mind for hours, not thinking, not planning, not the ordinary following of the mind that happens when a person is trying to solve a problem or compose a letter or remember something they need to do before the end of the day. Something different, the particular quality of following that happens in deep meditation, when the ordinary contents of the mind have quieted and what remains is something more fundamental, something that does not have a name in ordinary language, but that a person knows when they arrive at it. The quality of awareness itself, the room in which everything else occurs. He had been sitting for hours in the forest. The species of forest does not matter much, but the detail of it matters. It was the kind of forest that is dark before dark, where the canopy is thick enough that the last light fails earlier than it fails in the open, where the sounds of the day shift gradually into the sounds of the night in a way that is different from anything that happens in a room or a village. The forest has its own rhythm at that hour. Insects that are silent in the afternoon begin to speak. Something moves in the underbrush. The temperature drops in a way that is immediate and specific. A change you feel in the skin before you register it in the mind. He was sitting in the middle of this. He had been sitting in middles like this for years, in forests, in kavis, in the charnel grounds outside villages in northeastern Thailand, where he had studied with Ajahn Mun, who had taught him that the practice was not a preparation for something else but was itself the thing, and that the forest and the dark and the sounds at the edge of hearing were not obstacles to the practice, but were part of it. He was born in 1902 in the province of Ubon Ratchathani, the same province that had produced Ajahn Mun before him. He was a farmer's son, which meant he understood from childhood the particular relationship between a body and the earth it works. The way work done close to the ground produces a different relationship with time than work done at a desk or in a court. Time in a field is not the same as time in a building. It moves differently. You feel it differently. The seasons are not abstract. The impermanence is visible in every season of the crops. He was ordained at 21 and found his way to Ajahn Mun, whose reputation as a meditation teacher of unusual depth had already spread through the northeastern provinces. He sat with Ajahn Mun for years, and what he received there was not primarily instruction, though there was instruction, but rather a quality of presence that made him understand what the practice was actually for, what it was pointing toward. He left that proximity eventually. The way students of genuine teachers eventually leave proximity because the teacher has pointed them toward something that can only be found in solitude. And solitude means being alone with what the teacher pointed at. He wandered. He sat. He went deeper into forests and stayed longer in caves, and sat through more nights than most people sit through in years of committed practice. And what he was following, each time, was the same thread, the quality of awareness underneath the noise of ordinary mental life, the space in which the thoughts occurred rather than the thoughts themselves. On this particular night in the forest, he followed that thread further than he had followed it before. The texts do not say exactly where or when this happened. They preserve the event in the form that Ajahn Thate himself described it, which is the form of an interior account, what he noticed, what he felt, what the progression of the following looked like from inside it. He described following his awareness down through the layers of what consciousness usually contains until he arrived at something that felt, from inside, like an edge. The edge of what awareness could sustain while still being aware of itself sustaining. He described a feeling that was not quite fear and not quite recognition. The feeling you have at the top of something high, when you can see both the height you have climbed and the distance below, and the body registers both the achievement and the vertigo simultaneously. He was at a place in his meditation that he had not been before. He could feel, in whatever way these things can be felt from inside, that the next movement would carry him past a threshold, that something would happen if he released the last hold. He described it as the question of whether to let go completely, not of any particular thought or feeling or narrative, of the last sense of being the one who was following. He made a choice. He chose not to let go. He came back. He described what happened in the return as a kind of clarity about what was on both sides of that threshold. Not certainty about what lay beyond. Huangbo's answer echoes here. The honest not knowing, but something about the threshold itself. The knowledge that it existed. The knowledge that the thing on the other side of it was real and not a construction of the imagination. And, in the coming back, the knowledge that everything on this side of the threshold, every ordinary breath, every sound in the forest, every sensation in the body, every moment of the ordinary day was the same territory as what lay beyond it. Seen from a different angle, the threshold was not between here and somewhere else. It was a threshold between two ways of seeing the same place. He came back to the forest. He breathed. The sounds around him were the same sounds that had been there before he went in. The dark was the same dark. And it was not the same. He described this to his students years later, in the careful way that practitioners describe things that language cannot fully contain, using the shape of what can be said to gesture toward what cannot. He said the experience had changed his relationship with death, not because he had seen what lay beyond it, but because he had touched the edge of the transition and understood something about the nature of transitions that he had not understood before. Transitions, he said, are not the end of anything. They are places where one form releases into another. The breath releases. The body releases. the identity that has been organized around a particular name and history and set of relationships, releases. And what releases does not stop, it continues in a different form. The way the incense smoke that Dogen watched when his mother died did not stop, but became the air in the room. The way the sound of Linji's strike against the floor did not stop, but became the silence. The way the flowers in Luang Pu Mun's vase did not stop blooming, but became something the third day that was different from and continuous with what the first day had been. He did not say he was not afraid. He said the fear had changed quality. It had become something more like standing at the edge of the water before you go in, which is different from fearing the water itself. The water is cold and real, and you are about to enter it. The body knows this and responds accordingly. But the response is not avoidance. It is preparation. It is the gathering that happens before a person enters something large. He sat with his students for decades after that night. He was the head of the Thai forest tradition lineage after Ajahn Mun's death, the one to whom the practitioners of that tradition looked when they needed orientation or guidance, or simply the presence of someone who had been where they were trying to go. He was known for a quality of steadiness, not the steadiness of someone who has suppressed the difficulty of being alive, but the steadiness of someone who has been to the edge of the largest question and come back, changed by the going. He died in 1994, at the age of 91. The texts say he was ready. Not in the way people say someone is ready when they mean resigned. He had not given up. He had simply arrived, over those 91 years, at a relationship with the threshold that was different from the relationship most people carry. Not without feeling, not without the particular quality that in another story we called fear, and in this story might be called respect, but without the need to hold the process at a distance any longer. He had been to the edge. He had come back. He had spent the intervening decades living on the same side of the threshold as everyone else, in the ordinary forest, in the ordinary day, doing the ordinary work of practice and teaching and being present to the people who came to him. And everything he had seen at the edge was present in the ordinary, in every ordinary moment, if you paid the right kind of attention. This is the last story tonight. And this is what it is offering, not an answer about what happens at the threshold. Ajahn Thate did not go past it. Huangbo said plainly that he did not know. The question remains the question it has always been. Open, honest, unresolved in the way that the most real questions are always unresolved. What it offers instead is this: the threshold is not the end. Whatever it is, the place where the breath stops, or the place where one form releases into another, or the place where the understanding that has been building across a lifetime arrives at the silence it has been moving toward. It is not a wall. It is a doorway. And on this side of it, right now, in this room, in this dark, in this particular hour, that is already becoming the next one. You are in the same territory. The 9 people who have walked through tonight, the young mother on the road in Savatthi, the woman who stood in the cemetery and asked her question, the monk who slept in forests for 50 years, the man from Kyoto, who found something in China that he spent his life trying to describe, the king in the forest at dawn, the poet who gave away his robe, the teacher who struck the floor instead of speaking, the minister and the master in their honest conversation. And now this forest monk at the edge of the dark, they were all in the same territory, all of them feeling, from different angles, the same thing that you are feeling right now, if you are very still and very honest, the aliveness of this moment, and the way this moment is already changing into something else, and how these two facts are not in conflict. You are alive. The moment is moving. The dark is holding you. Something is coming that you do not know the shape of, the next hour, the next day, the next form that the thing you call yourself will take as the years continue their particular impermanence. You do not need to know its shape tonight. Tonight, you only need to rest. Let the breath be what it is. Let the body be heavy and soft and warm in the way it becomes when the effort stops. Let the 9 stories settle somewhere in you, not as information to be stored and retrieved, but as something more like weather that has moved through and left the air cleaner. Kisa Gotami sat at the road's edge and understood she was not alone. Buddha stood in the cemetery and asked the question that no one could answer, and kept going until she found the room where the answer was waiting. Luang Puman watched the starburst flowers go from the first day to the 3rd day and said to his students today, "While you still have the day, practice." Dogen watched the incense smoke at 7 years old and spent his life describing what it showed him. Buddha walked out of the palace and into the forest and said, "To no one in particular. In the dark, what happiness." Ryokan watched the thief go down the mountain and turned back to what the thief had left behind. Linji struck the floor and waited, in the silence after, for the student to hear what the silence was saying. Huangbo said, "I do not know," and continued. Ajahn Thate came to the edge and came back, and spent decades living in the ordinary light of the ordinary day, with the edge always present just underneath. Patient, unhurried, waiting. The breath moves in. The breath moves out. The night continues its long turning. This moment becomes the next one without effort, without your permission, without requiring you to understand it, or accept it, or feel any particular way about it. Let it. Just let it. You have been held long enough by this. The rest is yours now. Let it come. Before the final words of this night, there is one more thing about Ajahn Thate that the tradition kept and that belongs here. He came from the same province as Ajahn Mun. He studied with the same teacher. He walked the same forests, slept under the same kind of clot in the rain, ate from the same kind of bowl. And yet what he found at the edge of the dark that night in the forest was his own. Not a transmission, not a borrowed understanding, not something that could have been given to him by Ajahn Mun or by any of the other teachers whose proximity had shaped his practice. Something that required exactly his life, his body, his particular years of following the thread, his particular choice in that particular moment to go this far and not further, to come back, to return with what the returning contained. This is true of every person in these stories. None of them found what they found by being given it. Kisa Gotami could not have understood what she understood without walking the city herself. No one could have walked it for her. The understanding required her feet on the actual roads, her hands knocking on the actual doors, her body sitting at the actual roadside in the failing light. Buddha's years of wandering were hers. Luang Pumun's charnel grounds were his. Dogen's crossing of the sea and his years of looking before the answer arrived were irreducibly his own. The practice is not transferable. The pointing is transferable. The poem, the teaching, the story, the gesture toward the territory that someone else has already moved through. But the moving through itself has to be yours. You have been moving through something for as long as you have been alive. Your particular version of the road between doors. Your particular quality of charnel ground. Your particular crossing of the sea towards something you have heard is waiting on the other side, that may or may not look like what you expected when you arrive. The stories in this collection tonight are not meant to give you what they gave the people who lived them. They are meant to be the pointing, to let you feel, through the shapes of other lives, the shape of the territory you are already in. You are already in it. You have been in it your whole life. The impermanence is not something you are moving toward. You are made of it. Every breath you have ever taken has been taken in a body that was already changing into something else. Every moment you have ever inhabited has already been becoming the next one before you finished inhabiting this one. The river you have been sitting beside has been moving the whole time. This is not frightening, if you have been long enough with it tonight. In the dark and the quiet and the company of these 9 lives, it is what it always was, before the stories that fear tells about it had a chance to take hold. The movement that was present before the fear of the movement. The changing that simply is, without commentary. Ajahn Thate came to the edge of the dark and came back. He spent 91 years in the ordinary and the extraordinary, equally, not separating them, not requiring the extraordinary to be far away from the ordinary morning of any given day. The edge was always there. The threshold was always there. It did not require crisis or emergency to be present. It was simply the quality of the moment when the moment is fully inhabited. The depth that becomes visible when the surface quiets. You are at that surface right now. The quieting is already happening. The practice tonight has been nothing more dramatic than lying down in the dark and letting the stories move through you and following the breath through each one. And yet that is enough. It is always enough. The stories of 50 years in the forest and the crossing of the sea and the night at the edge of the dark were pointing at something that does not require any of those things. That is present in the ordinary hour. In the breath. In the weight of the body on the surface where it is resting. Ajahn Thate knew this. He came back from the edge knowing it in a way he had not known it before. You have never left the place he came back to. You are already here. The breath moves in. The breath moves out. The dark outside is the dark outside. The silence in the room is the silence in the room. Something in you is already dissolving into sleep, the way the incense smoke dissolved into the air of the room when Dogen was 7 years old. The way the strike against the floor dissolved into the silence that followed. The way the starburst flowers dissolved from the first day into the third. The dissolving is not loss. It is continuation. The breath releases and then arrives again. You release into sleep and then arrive again. Hours from now, in the morning, changed in ways you will not be able to name, rested by something that had no name. Let the name go. Let the knowing go. Let the breath do what the breath does. Kisa Gotami set her son down and walked back with her hands empty. Buddha walked toward the cemetery in the dark, on purpose. The monk sat in the forest for 50 years and watched the flowers and called it practice. The child watched the smoke and spent his life describing what smoke is. The king said what happiness, and did not need anyone else to hear it. The poet gave the robe away and turned back to the moon. The teacher struck the floor. The master said, "I do not know." The monk came to the edge and came back. And now there is nothing else. The night is doing what the night does. The rest is yours. Let it come. You have traveled a long way tonight, not in distance, in the other direction, inward and downward, into the part of the night where the stories live and the breath slows, and the questions that were pressing in the morning have become something quieter. The way fire becomes embers, still warm, no longer demanding anything from you. 9 people walked through this night beside you. 9 lives from across 2,500 years and several continents and many different kinds of dark. They were not saints, most of them. Or not only that, they were people who had been given difficulties they did not choose, and questions they could not avoid, and long roads between where they started and where they eventually arrived. They walked those roads, and what they found on the other side was not certainty, not the removal of impermanence, not the end of change, but something that made the change possible to inhabit, something that made the moving possible to rest inside. You have been inside the moving all your life. Every breath, every year that has changed the face in the mirror into something a little different from what it was the year before. Every version of yourself that has already become someone else. All of it impermanent. All of it continuous. All of it the same river that the texts have been pointing at for 2,500 years. Changing form, but not stopping. Not ending. Not arriving at a wall. There is something I want to say before this ends, and I want to say it plainly. I do not know, with any certainty, what impermanence ultimately means. I sit with that not knowing the same way Huangbo sat with it, with something that has changed over time from fear into honest respect. The respect you have for a question that is larger than you, that has not asked your permission, that will not be resolved by thinking harder. I do not know. And the not knowing is not empty. It is a room, and spending time in the room changes the way everything outside it looks. That is all I have. That is what these 9 stories are. Tomorrow will ask things of you. Real things. The obligations and the frictions and the ordinary difficulties of a life being lived in the world. They will be there. But you may find, tomorrow, that you meet them slightly differently. Not transformed, not enlightened, just slightly more aware of the ground under your feet, the breath in the body, the fact that this particular day is a form that will not be repeated exactly. That would be enough. It would be more than enough. Let your body be completely heavy now. Let every place where you have been holding something today release. Slowly, the way a fist releases when the effort finally passes. The night is large, and the dark is soft, and you are held by something that does not need a name. Sleep well. Thank you for being here tonight. Sleepful Buddha.